In impenetrable darkness, the first bloody sparks swirled. There were more and more of them. That night, a huge mansion burned to the ground under the terrifying roar of flames. In the middle of the hellish fire stood an exhausted young man, mentally admitting that his whole life had turned out to be a complete failure. He seemed to be drowning in his own despair. He could not stop his younger brothers from fleeing and did not save those who stayed nearby. Suddenly, heavy footsteps struck through the crackling fire. From the smoke emerged a killer in a mask whose cold gaze met the doomed eyes of the young man. He muttered a curse against the bloody cult through clenched teeth. The bitter realization finally overwhelmed him. He could not protect his home. The cultists simultaneously drew their swords, preparing to erase the Songamun clan from history forever. First the strike, then the talk. Understood. The young man smiled sadly and firmly grasped the hilt of his weapon. His martial arts might be weak, but he was Li Hui, head of the clan, and he would face this fight with dignity. In the midst of hellish flames, he tightly gripped the sword and shouted that at least he would choose the place of his death himself. He rushed forward, cutting through the fiery wall towards the killers in black. With a fierce cry, the warrior crossed his blade with a whole hail of enemy strikes. His hand crushed the hilt to white bones, barely holding back the pressure. Sparks scattered in the darkness. Suddenly, the space was cleaved by a devastating strike of pink energy, instantly sweeping away his defense. Bleeding, he bowed his head. What a miserable life. And in vain he took upon himself the burden of clan head just because of the title of senior apprentice. Despair clouded his eyes. If only he had known that everything would end in nothing but regrets. Darkness and tiny air bubbles. With a dull splash, the body went limp to the bottom. Suddenly, underwater, frightened children's eyes opened wide, staring in shock at the burning light above. The surface was rapidly approaching. With a desperate jerk, he broke free from under the water, greedily gasping for air. Surfacing, he looked around in confusion. All around, as far as the eye could see, a wide river was raging. He was stunned by shock, for he clearly remembered how the cultist's blade had just cut his body. Suddenly, a weak cry of his younger brother reached him, and he froze. Below, in the turbulent whirlpools under the bridge, a child was desperately struggling. It was Hoenn, a boy once abandoned by his own mother, the fourth youngest apprentice, whom he had personally cared for while their teacher traveled the world. The memory hit him hard, the boy's laughter on his back, and then a torn kite and bitter guilt for once failing to save him. Realizing that his brother was still alive, he felt tears welling up in his eyes. With a desperate scream, he rushed straight into the raging current. A hand sharply reached through the water's thickness. A loud splash, and he finally firmly grabbed his brother. Half-conscious Hoenn barely exhaled to him underwater, releasing the last bubbles. They were diving deeper and deeper, and the body was already rapidly numbing from the icy water. Memory stabbed with the old pain. Then the body had frozen the same way, and he could not save a close person, but now he sharply opened his eyes. His hands were enveloped by a powerful blue energy. The Manhwa mind technique, which he had just begun to study, had to protect his brother from death. He mentally commanded his own body to move with all his might. Blue lightning cut through the water's thickness as he desperately pressed the child to himself. His fragile body did not yet have a strong foundation, and the young man painfully squinted from the overstrain. Forced circulation of power mercilessly tore the meridians from the inside. Suddenly, he froze in shock. Instead of exhaustion, the internal energy began to rapidly increase, multiplying many times with each second. He glanced at the pale face of the unconscious Hoenn. This time, the older brother will save you, he decided, and the water vortex around them exploded with new strength. A fist clenched to a crunch in a dazzling blue flash. A powerful impulse pierced the water's thickness, swiftly carrying them both from the very depths to the light of the surface. The sensation sharpened incredibly. Now he perfectly read the river's current, every movement of a fish's fin, and the tiniest bubble around. His eyes flashed with blue light, and his consciousness sharply expanded. An echo rang in his head. The one encompasses 10,000, and 10,000 become one. The space was torn by a dazzling pillar of light. Then the sky broke with a downpour, and fish were thrown onto the wet boards. A heavy step through the puddles. The young man walked under the rain, barely dragging the unconscious boy on his back. His strength finally betrayed him. He collapsed exhausted onto his knees. His head was spinning, and his hands darkened from tension barely held the weight of his body. Due to forced circulation, these muscles twisted from unbearable pain. The body was completely exhausted. But through the pain on his face appeared a faint smile. He carefully pressed the boy to himself and sighed with relief. This time Hoenn would live. Now only one thing remained: to return home to his clan. Gathering the crumbs of will, he again threw the child over his back and broke into a run. The white-haired one rushed as fast as he could to the sunlit yard, tightly pressing his burden to his chest. The soul scraped the ground. He sharply braked before the stone stairs. A brief moment of silence. Two children stood below, and the girl immediately joyfully called out to her older brother. Her joy instantly faded when she saw his gray hair. The boy nearby turned pale and whispered the name Tango Yule in shock. The young man, in turn, looked at them with a warm smile, barely holding back tears of relief. The little girl almost cried from panic, asking what had happened to both of them and what about Sheva. Looking at them, he finally believed that the miracle had happened and he had truly returned to the past. Late at night, sitting by the bed of the saved comrade, he admitted to himself that everyone had dreamed at least once of turning back time, and he was no exception. His gaze dangerously darkened by some gloomy thoughts. For a moment, he just silently stared into the void, and the shadow on his face grew thicker. He grabbed his head in complete despair. Would he really have to endure all this hell again? A teacher appeared in his memory, a carefree man who was always wandering somewhere instead of attending to the clan's affairs, although he was kind to children. Because of his frivolity, all the household management of the fields and shops fell on his shoulders, and the money was still barely enough for food. Moreover, the master constantly dragged new orphans from the street. He laughed nervously, loudly calling themselves a clan. In reality, they were just an ordinary shelter for beggars. In the night silence, he sat by the bed of his sick younger brother. The fever finally subsided. Despite everything, they were a true clan founded by the swordsman Sonun Yu Youngjun. In the district, he was considered an outstanding warrior and the best blade master. Only the teacher never passed his skills to the students. The young man bitterly guessed that it was due to his own incompetence. The second and third students, barely becoming masters, simply left, abandoning the impoverished clan to the mercy of competitors while he toiled like a cursed man. And all this only so that in the end he would be stabbed by fanatics from the bloody cult. He grimly clenched his teeth, realizing the bitter truth of his past. The white-haired youth sprawled on the floor, hands behind his head, and aloud declared he would no longer live like this. He bitterly admitted that before he only carried the duties of the senior student, brother, and clan head. His palm quietly slid across the floor. He definitely was not going to repeat his failed life. The young man's gaze softened as he looked at the sleeping boy with a bandaged head. In this life, everything must be different. In the dimly lit room, Li Hui knelt before his teacher, who was stunned, and repeated what he had just heard. The student respectfully pressed his forehead to the very floor. The master frowned, still not believing his own ears. Li Hui raised his head and decisively declared, from today, he would live exclusively as he wished. The teacher gloomily asked again what Li Hui had just blurted out. The student looked straight into his eyes and resolutely stated that from now on, he would live as he wished. A tense silence hung in the air. The teacher imagined Li Hui as a wild street hooligan and shuddered. But in reality, the boy sat meekly before him on the floor. The teacher sighed heavily. He rose from behind the table and called the student for a walk. Li Hui blinked in confusion. A full moon shone over the mansion. They silently walked through the night yard. Suddenly, the teacher turned around and said, on the side, the gray-haired Li Hui seems to be the mentor because he does whatever he wants, and that's why he turned gray so early. The boy's face turned to stone, and then he mentally screamed in shock. His strict teacher had just tried to joke. The teacher thoughtfully rubbed his chin. He moved forward, leaving the blonde student to look at his back in confusion. Suddenly, the man's face softened. He admitted that he had long wanted to thank him. It was thanks to the boy that Hoenn had survived then. These words instantly threw the young man back into the past, to the black day of Hoenn's death. Then the master performed a farewell dance with a sword under the moon for 49 days straight, without stopping. He did not show tears, but the loss was tearing him to pieces. I know you suffered because of my indifference, the teacher said quietly. I am sincerely grateful. His heavy palm warmly lay on the boy's head. From now on, he was free to live as he wished. In the man's eyes, a paternal calm was readable. The student was stunned by how easily he obtained the long-awaited freedom when the master asked about his further plans. A brief pause hung in the night courtyard. The young man awkwardly scratched the back of his head and sighed that he had no idea what to do next. The teacher smiled gently and admitted that he was his first student. The young man's eyes opened wide in surprise. He tightly clenched his clothes on his chest, listening to the mentor's promise to always be on his side. The gaze trembled. A blush flooded his cheeks. The boy had no idea that the teacher had valued him all his life, and his heart beat wildly in his chest. Suddenly, the vision broke off. The young man jerked sharply, breathing heavily in the midst of sparkling energy. Under the moonlight, the man dryly remarked that the time was late, while the student stared confusedly at his own palm. The teacher turned around and ordered to head back. But Departing, he barely noticeably and warmly smiled at his thoughts about this little boy. The picture sharply changed to a grim, plague-ridden village. Among skeletons and flocks of crows sat an exhausted child with an empty gaze. From the darkness, a hand weakly reached out. The boy remained the only survivor and was now slowly dying of hunger. The man froze in the middle of the night cemetery, looking at the exhausted child among human bones. The foundling turned out to be the same age as his own long-deceased son. The master lowered his gaze. Abandoning the child to fate was beyond his strength. A large hand reached out to the weary little one. Years passed, the apprentice grew quiet and obedient, while the man remained cold and indifferent to him. He did not even notice how the boy matured, and now firmly decided to become a true father mentor to him. A warm smile flashed across his face as he looked at the light-filled courtyard and mentally acknowledged that this was his home. Their school under the calm glow of the full moon. Stepping into the corridor, where a terrifying, bloody aura was already raging, he finally understood his true path. From the darkness, red demonic hands reached out to him, and although the past cannot be erased, he confidently took a step forward. The master squeezed his hand. From now on, he would become an unshakable support for his students. The man with a slight smile wondered what kind of people these children would grow into. Suddenly, his gaze sharpened. The air around unexpectedly stirred, causing the warrior to grip his sword tighter. In the distance, a powerful whirlwind of energy spun, pulsing like a living breath. At the very epicenter of this storm stood Kvi. Everything started again. The youth froze with closed eyes, completely surrendering to the element. Massive water flows were roaming the yard, simultaneously warm and icy, dense and incredibly heavy. These opposing energies intertwined into a furious whirlwind and began to penetrate directly into his body. Kvi concentrated all this power into a shining blue sphere right in front of his chest. The energy that had just greedily poured into him suddenly surged away, like a sea ebb. Usually internal strength first settles in the dantian, and only then circulates through the meridians, forming the small and great heavenly orbits. But now his agitated body brutally ignored all these classic stages. Powerful energy flooded the body and immediately disappeared, making it clear this is a completely different method of the Manhi mind. However, a sudden insight flared up. This is also the correct path, where the one hides 10,000 within itself, and 10,000 merge into one. A dazzling flash tore the space. He realized that it was the immersion in the river that made him subconsciously recall the true mantra. With this fragile thought, he powerlessly sank to the bottom. A huge whirlpool of blue energy lifted his body. The boy stood mesmerized before the incredible glow. In the stream of light, a familiar silhouette of a man with a sword suddenly emerged. He looked around stunned, recognizing the familiar walls, flower beds, and every tree in the garden. It was Songyumun. The dearest people from the past appeared before his eyes. The house where he was a senior student, where he lived his whole life, and where he met his end. He smiled quietly. He immersed himself where love strangely mixed with hatred. Resentment, guilt, suffocation, and calm merged into one turbulent stream. This whirlpool revealed to him the absolute unity of all existence in Songyumun. A dazzling flash tore through space, bringing the final revelation. The one contains everything, and everything is the one. The young man turned sharply. Pillars of bright energy struck from above, completely engulfing his figure. He felt the power streaming through his body and exhaled with satisfaction. Certain that he had finally grasped the essence, his lips stretched into a smile from the long-awaited feeling of release, when suddenly something inside cracked loudly. The boy looked down in horror. Right at the spot of his spiritual center, a black hole was expanding. An invisible blow shattered his energy and the reality around him like fragile glass. Losing balance, he plunged into complete darkness and feverishly grabbed his stomach. His brain refused to believe what had happened. His dantian had vanished without a trace. All this deep mystical experience ended with him destroying his only source of power with his own hands. Congratulations, Li Hui's mind ironically flashed, while cold sweat of despair rolled down his temple. The tall warrior in a black cloak stopped in front of the boy and unexpectedly greeted him. With a slight smile, he acknowledged that the young man had finally found his path and asked what he had seen inside Manhwa. The master looked at him with a warm, attentive squint. The boy froze in confusion, having no idea what exactly he had just discovered. While the youth panicked, realizing that his dantian had disappeared, the mentor explained, "The divine art of Manhi has 10,000 interpretations." He raised his hand, drawing a shining blue line in the air. A brief moment, and the mentor made a sharp lunge, almost cutting the student with an energy blade. A wave of power sharply tugged the ribbon in the youth's hair. The shining blade froze, and the man calmly continued, "Everyone must find their own path. Everything depended on this choice. Whether Manhwa would become a divine gift or turn into the most terrifying demonic art, the tension instantly dissipated and the master, relieved, placed his hand on the boy's head. He gently tousled his hair, sincerely glad that the child would not have to repeat his difficult fate. After all, this man was not just a teacher, but an outstanding fighter who had no equal in the entire Onsong County. He touched his forehead in confusion, not understanding why the mentor was so happy about their different paths. The gaze froze. The boy realized that he knew absolutely nothing about his master. He only calmly sent him inside after a long day, and the apprentice bowed obediently. He watched the man's back for a long time as he disappeared into the darkness of the courtyard. Before, he constantly complained about the stinginess of the lessons, but now he grasped the truth. One contains 10,000, and 10,000 is one. The master's footsteps were fading away. Looking at the night estate, he accepted his task. A bird will never teach a chick stuck in its shell to fly. But the ghostly image of the mentor's strength gave no peace. The young man still could not comprehend what exactly he understood today. He stood motionless. Faces of those closest floated before his eyes, reminding him of the main question. What is the true essence of his own Manhwa? The night darkness hung over the roof. Completely exhausted, the boy trudged heavily down the empty corridor. Reaching out to the massive frame, he sighed wearily, dreaming only that someone would open these doors for him. The young man pressed on the massive bookcase and it clicked dully. He froze in confusion. Closed. The boy smiled nervously, realizing that the door was unlikely to obey ordinary words. The metallic sound of an unlocked lock broke the silence. The heavy doors slid aside by themselves. The young man lowered his gaze to his palm, his face stretched in shock. Could it be that he just used telekinesis? This absolute technique allowed higher masters to control flying swords. But now, with the power of thought, he could only lift a kitchen ladle from the floor. The wooden handle cut through the air. The ladle fit perfectly in his hand, although the boy had no idea how he suddenly mastered this skill. He calmly turned back to the boiling cauldron. Stirring the brew, the young man smiled ironically. His current strength was just enough to lift the weight of the kitchen utensils. But as he tossed a log into the fire, he was not disappointed at all. For above all, he dreamed not of great battles, but of a quiet and carefree life. A new day began with the usual chores. The flame roared with a rumble in the stove. The young man froze, enjoying the flows of hot energy. His dantian was destroyed, but the power of Manhwa martial art now freely circulated throughout his body. He slowly stirred the boiling water in the cauldron, sweeping the yard, carrying water. Any household routine now constantly nourished his energy. For martial arts masters, this is an absolute waste, but it suited him perfectly. The boy wiped sweat from his forehead, rejoicing in his boundless endurance, when suddenly he was stunned. He had once again automatically polished the entire house to a shine. The young man despairingly grabbed his head. Decades of hard work had ingrained into his very subconscious. The panic was interrupted by a child's voice, and the boy awkwardly turned around, instantly remembering the hungry Hoenn. A toddler timidly peeked from behind the doorframe. The brother quietly asked about food, and the young man gently called him to the already set table. Hoenn almost flew up with joy, causing a warm smile on the elder's face. With happy laughter, he rushed through the sunny courtyard. Watching him go, the boy calmly squinted. For now, such a quiet life suited him perfectly. The sunlit estate breathed tranquility, so he decided to postpone thoughts about his future. The teacher and students gathered around the round table. Looking at the mentor, he suddenly realized that in their past life they almost never ate together. A smile played on his lips. The old man was sincerely happy that little Hoenn had survived. He took the sticks. Next to him, the boy was snorting angrily and puffing his cheeks, unable to cope with lunch. With one quick movement, he tossed the food high into the air, asking who would get this portion. Hoenn opened his mouth in delight, and the older brother immediately shouted, demanding a piece for himself. The little one joyfully reached out. The treat hit the target exactly. The boy chewed contentedly, sending sparks of happiness, while the other two just blinked in confusion. A carefree moment. He smiled softly and admitted to himself that all this noisy fuss was actually very convenient. An ordinary bean flew into the air with a whistle. The little one excitedly poked it with his finger, wondering why waste telekinesis on such trifles. He shone joyfully. The older man silently propped his chin, watching this game. The children cheerfully buzzed, trying to repeat the magical hand movements. The girl listened to herself. The more often she used the power, the more energy she received. Suddenly, the being grew tiny legs and danced amusingly over the plates. The little one laughed loudly. All were spellbound, leaning over the table. She smiled warmly, deciding to linger a little longer in this carefree moment. Suddenly, the elder sharply interrupted the idol, In 15 days, all will gather in the main sect. Control instantly disappeared, and Bob listlessly plunged into the food. A puzzled silence hung over the table. Did you say gathering? He asked confusedly, eyes wide open in surprise. Even before the founding of the gate, Master Sun Wei arrived in Ansan County with the bewildered boy. At that time, power in the city was firmly held by 4 martial arts schools. The Oso sect, led by a huge smiling leader. The restrained Changhyun family and the Down faction. The head of the latter always hid his cunning gaze behind a fan. And of course, the battered Shagan gang. When the gate of Sun Wei arose in Ansan, these 4 schools offered the master to form a peaceful alliance of 5 sects. But they all sat quietly, not daring to go against the master, the strongest warrior in all of Ansan. Gathering. The young man shuddered, realizing he hadn't heard this word for many years. After the master's death, this tradition disappeared, and from the darkness, greedy hands quickly reached out. The enemies feared only him, so without a leader, the gate rapidly sank to the bottom. Amid all this chaos, it was the Shagan gang that climbed to the top. They quickly seized the former influence of Sun Wei, subjugating the city with insane terror. A massive dark fortress loomed in the distance. This power had already destroyed or absorbed 3 other schools. The young man least of all wanted to deal with the Shagan gang. In his past life, he suffered the most from them when he had to lead the school without the master's protection. His fist clenched tightly. This enmity had begun much earlier. The silhouette of Guak Chol Yu ominously emerged in his memory. The young man sighed wearily, calming himself. This time everything was different, because he had already saved Ho-chan. Under the watchful eye of the little one nearby, he admitted that the events of the past were unlikely to repeat exactly. The boy suddenly jumped up joyfully, begging his older brother to show the trick once more. With a restrained smile, the young man spun the toy on a string in the air. Looking over his people at the dinner table, he silently prayed that everything would go without trouble. The day of the great gathering had come. The hall was bustling. They had to hire a bunch of helpers from neighboring shops and visiting courtyards. The final preparations were in full swing. The master was again pulling silver from somewhere. Despite the school's total poverty, the huge money spent on hosting guests was not just to put on a show. The master stood in the middle of the room, hands behind his back, calmly noting that everything was going wonderfully. The students sighed inwardly. Although this collection forced the factions to return money to the city, their school definitely had nothing to share. The mentor smiled warmly, calling it the only day when the poor and travelers could simply rest and have fun. The young man suddenly realized it was for these people that his taciturn master had carried this tradition on his shoulders for years. Under the cauldrons, the flame roared loudly, raising clouds of hot steam upwards. He easily winked, acknowledging that all this had truly turned into a great celebration. Life was already bustling around. The little boy was waving his arms energetically, excitedly telling the guests how his older brother swiftly pulled him out of the river. The adults burst into genuine laughter. The boy amusingly imitated the turbulent waves, and the guests good-naturedly teased the little warrior, demanding the continuation of the story. Meanwhile, near the gates, another boy seriously and politely pointed the way to new visitors. The guests smiled, touched, impressed by the little one's mature prudence and manners. Meanwhile, the little boy dashed off somewhere, lightly stomping with his bare feet. The older brother looked back. Just behind his back, a little girl had timidly hidden. The women around beamed with smiles, looking at the little girl with affection. But she blushed deeply and instantly hid behind the young man's back. He gently stroked her hair, understanding that she simply was not used to such warmth. After parting from her relatives, the girl hardly saw any affection, but his thoughts were interrupted by a loud voice announcing the arrival. Someone confidently headed towards the massive gates. Heavy footsteps echoed loudly off the stone slabs. Their group was already waiting in the square when the elderly leader in front burst into loud laughter. It turned out they had come too early. He cheerfully complained about his own impatience. A burly, mustachioed man came out to meet them. Guak Sahu, leader of the Shagon gang nicknamed Wolfax. The elder calmly greeted him, although the very appearance of this gang brought tension into the air. Guak Sahu responded with a feigned friendly smile, behind which hid a vain and greedy predator, and added that today he had brought his son with him. The boy beside him respectfully greeted as if he had come to gain experience. The girl behind fiercely gritted her teeth. She clearly remembered how, after the master's death, this very man mercilessly trampled her home. He pierced his interlocutor with a cold look and declared that the true curse of their bond lay somewhere else entirely. In memory emerged the image of the one who once completely destroyed the gate of Sun Wei, forcing the enemy to miserably crawl in the mud. The stranger confidently grinned and introduced himself as Guak Chol Yu, the junior leader of the Shagon gang. A noisy, crowded banquet was going on around. He watched puzzled as the guests calmly devoured the food. In his past life, this man ignored all gatherings. The puzzle came together. There was no funeral. The meeting had taken place earlier, and now the living little Ho-hyun was happily tugging his sleeve. He smiled warmly and gently asked the child to manage lunch on his own today. For a moment, silence reigned. Putting down the spoon, he grimly realized, due to the change of the event date, the past life events would no longer repeat. The memory cut deep. A beaten, bloodied face from that erased future. He sharply turned around and called the second brother. The hand heavily rested on the armrest. The order sounded quietly but firmly. As soon as they finished eating, the brother must immediately take the younger ones and hide in the room. The young man anxiously asked if the elder brother could handle the guests alone. He strictly ordered him to go to the room and not to come out under any circumstances. Tense pause. The boy flinched. Meanwhile, the first visitors were gradually arriving at the yard. The elder calmly instructed the men to clean up well here, to which they gladly agreed. He deliberately sent the younger ones away, but the anxiety still did not subside. Suddenly, the quick patter of bare feet and a desperate cry sounded. Older brother. A crying toddler flew into the room. Recognizing the crying Kohen, the elder sharply turned around. The child rushed towards him at full speed. The boy clung to him tightly, sobbing bitterly. The young man hugged the little one, and hiding his darkened gaze, quietly asked where the rest were now. In the past, they had already had fierce clashes with Shagan's gang. Little Tango Yo froze when the big guy in black disdainfully threw in his face that he was just a pathetic orphan. The boy barely had time to blink when a heavy boot swung and hit him in the jaw. It wasn't even a fight, but a merciless beating one-sidedly. Although Tango Yo was called a future genius of martial arts, back then he was still very green. He was no different from ordinary weak children. A young man in the white rushed into the room and froze. An open conflict with the bandits would mean ruin for their newly founded school. Two thugs silently and arrogantly drilled the newcomer with their gaze. Understanding the consequences for the teacher, the young man instantly fell to his knees before the offenders and loudly shouted an apology. He bowed his head low to the floor, begging them to pretend nothing had happened. Beaten Tango Yul looked at this in shock through tears. That day became his first and last. The young man tightly pressed the little one to himself, but his desperate look forever imprinted on the boy's heart, instantly destroying all childhood hopes. He sprang from his place. His whole life was eaten away by regret about this moment. This time I will not make the same mistake, he vowed in his mind, grabbing the child in his arms. And very close by, three men in black were mercilessly kicking a boy who desperately shouted at them not to touch the senior student. For a moment, a heavy silence hung. The leader of the attackers sneered disgustedly, irritated by all this fuss. He turned away, but a bloodied hand suddenly grabbed his boot tightly. The beaten boy raised his tear-streaked face and rasped through his teeth a demand to apologize. The big guy glared down fiercely. Apologize for calling him a younger orphan? A heavy boot flew with full force straight into the youth's head. He fell, spitting blood under the cold mockery of the enemy about pathetic orphans. Blood poured over his forehead and lips, but the student stubbornly did not look away. The youth and the girl froze, shockingly watching how the senior student's body weakly flew away under another shout. He fixed his gaze on the stranger and tensely asked if he was not a young master from the Shagan gang. The latter only glanced disdainfully over his shoulder. The young man's face twisted with rage. He clenched his fists tightly. In the middle of the room, a pitiful scene unfolded. A beaten boy on his knees, a frightened girl, and a brazen offender in black. The big guy slowly stood up to his full height, looking contemptuously down at the beaten boy. For a brief moment, a confused silence fell in the room. With a broken head, the boy raised his eyes and sighed with hope, recognizing his senior apprentice. The young man clenched his fist with a crunch, fully understanding it would only get worse. Through tears, the girl blurted out that this scoundrel was the first to attack, calling them dirty orphans. The young master sneered disgustedly and said he had no intention of apologizing. At that very moment, a devastating blow smeared the confident smile across his face. The body of the offender flew to the other end of the room before the eyes of the frozen witnesses. The younger students froze, staring at the reliable back of their senior. A bright, carefree smile of a child flashed before the eyes. The young man looked at his own scarred hand, mentally asking the teacher for forgiveness. His gaze suddenly grew heavy. He decided not to hold himself back anymore and stepped forward decisively. The enemy, with a crimson aura, looked around in shock. "You? Hit me?" His eyes flashed with white light from rage. He fiercely glared at the audacious one, not understanding how some miserable student dared to attack him. Instead of excuses, the young man burst out with a furious battle cry. The beaten younger students looked in shock at the back of their senior through tears. Losing the last remnants of patience, the opponent swung for a devastating blow. With a terrible roar, the Crimson Fist cut through the air, but the young man did not retreat a step. He firmly caught the deadly attack with his bare palm. The senior student was harshly thrown back in a flash of red energy. He screamed with a roar, scraping his back against the floor amid the panic cries of the junior adepts. The spectators only sneered mockingly. The rumors about the young man's worthlessness were not false, and challenging such an opponent was pointless. The boy himself understood this. He was breathing heavily in a cloud of dust, barely mastering the basics of internal energy. He had never had a talent for martial arts. The enraged enemy instantly jumped to his feet, clenching a fist with a crimson aura. A lunge. A heavy blow mercilessly struck the young man right in the chest. The boy painfully gasped, taking the full force of the attack. He was sharply thrown back, his boots scraping loudly across the boards. It seemed like the end, but the young man stubbornly raised trembling fists, which only provoked a predatory smile from the attacker. With a shout, the elder suddenly sprang from his place like lightning, deciding to test the boy's strength. The young man only managed to grit his teeth and cross his arms for a deft block. The exhausted young man stubbornly raised his fists, and a blue haze flickered around his body. Fear flashed in the opponent's eyes. He recognized the released inner energy. The man in black abruptly sprang from his place, leaving behind only blurred shadows. But a lightning-fast counterstrike with a shining hand flew straight into his chest. The young man croaked that he had accepted the fight not at all for the younger students to watch his beating. The stunned enemy, with a scratched face, hissed fiercely at the audacious one. In blind rage, he lunged forward and gripped the boy's collar with a death grip. The tense duel instantly turned into a comical cloud of dust with chaotic kicks. The spectators exchanged confused glances, calling this spectacle a pathetic dogfight. The man in black suddenly jumped back with a broken forehead and shouted in shock to the senior student. A crying woman and a little girl who burst into loud sobs immediately rushed to the beaten young man. However, the boy calmly assessed the condition. Ordinary fists without energy did not cause him serious wounds. The enemy recoiled in horror when the relentless youth took a stance again, flashing an even brighter blue aura. A heavy silence hung before the clash. Blood flowed from the boy's broken nose, but he suddenly recognized this blue aura. It was Manhwa. Mentally deciding to put an end to this, he clenched his fist tightly. The enemy in the dark kimono suddenly changed his expression in surprise. A lightning-fast lunge forward. The youth instantly sprang from his place, and his right hand was enveloped in dazzling blue energy. With a deafening crack, the shining blade cut straight into the opponent, throwing him back. In the dimly lit hall, the man admitted with regret, he had no idea how painful it was to endure all this silently. The wounded young man looked at his bloody palm and bitterly admitted that he probably did not believe in him at all. Behind, children were crying in tears, and he mentally scolded himself for still bearing the title of older brother. Forcing himself to smile, he joked that at this rate, their students would be the first to fall. The stranger in black fell to the floor in fright. The young man loomed over him, clenching his fists tensely. One heavy step. The time had come to put an end to the old enmity forever. The enemy panicked and crawled back, justifying that they had only met today. His face twisted in horror. Ignoring him, the young man struck him with a fist. In his past life, he had already suffered enough in silence. A fire flashed before his eyes. Then, because of his weakness, the sect burned to ashes, and the people left. A devastating flying blow drove the opponent into the boards. A sudden, devastating blow knocked him off his feet. The man flew headlong, crashing with a thud onto the wooden floor. Someone's hand gripped his boot with a deathly grasp. The young man in white mercilessly dragged him across the floor like a sack. The fallen man shouted in panic, asking if this petty freak understood whom he had raised his hand against. An icy, piercing gaze was his only answer. Pressing the prisoner down with his knee, the young man calmly said he knew perfectly well who was in front of him, completely ignoring the hysterical screams about a psychopath. A heavy fist smashed into the face of the Shegongang heir. The victor fully understood that the influential father of the beaten man would not forgive this. Blood gushed from the broken nose, and the heir pitifully mumbled an apology. But the fist raised for another blow froze in the air. The young man firmly decided that he would never live as before. At that moment, the space was torn by the angry scream of an older man demanding explanations. The beaten man whined pitifully to his father, and the young man only sighed wearily. He slowly got up, allowing the frightened victim to crawl away in panic. Fast steps tore the silence. The pounding of hurried boots rapidly approached the hall. An angry man burst into the hall, looking for the one who dared to threaten his son. His gaze darted aside, and he suddenly froze. The head of the Shagan gang openly confronted the sect leader, demanding explanations for such a way of receiving guests. The man with the fan tried to reduce the fight to an ordinary children's quarrel, but he was immediately cut off. The father roughly jerked his beaten son by the scruff of the neck. The boy stood covered in bruises, breathing heavily from the experienced humiliation. The sect leader lowered his eyes and remained silent. The tension was suddenly cut by a malicious scream that called him a scoundrel. The head of Shagan boiled with rage. It drove him mad that some rootless orphan dared to raise a hand against his child. The accused young man remained completely calm, mentally regretting only that he had not sent the younger students to their rooms. The kids, with tears, clung to his robe and shouted that the rich kid hit first and insulted their father. The beaten offender froze in fear when the young man threw an icy glance at him and firmly stood up to defend his brother. The enemies rudely ordered the beaten young man to shut up and not interfere in the adult's conversation. His mentor darkened heavily. He coldly ordered from now on to speak only with him. The young man stepped back, allowing the teacher to stand between him and the opponent. The chief disciple of the hostile sect began to justify himself. Allegedly, the conflict flared up because of insults directed at his orphan sister. While he was complaining about the fight, the young man sharply retorted that he was simply fulfilling the duty of an older brother. "How dare this bastard!" the mentor suddenly roared, raising his fist in fury. The boy's eyes flashed with dark determination, but the next second he shuddered. The teacher stepped forward and in an icy tone asked the opponent if he had just had the imprudence to laugh. Dead silence. The mentor's face turned to stone from murderous anger. He menacingly loomed over the enemy, and the stunned student could only exhale in disbelief upon recognizing his teacher. Watching the audacious girl and the stunned old man, the man calmly noted that she greatly amused him. At that very moment, the courtyard was flooded with a thick, dark aura. He decided he had been sitting quietly for too long. A wave of dense, oppressive dark energy surged from him. His gaze became icy. The elder muttered distrustfully that someone had dared to cause such a commotion right in the heart of the Sangoman sect. The terrified elder immediately retreated and ordered his students to go inside to treat their wounds, while the girl was heavily gasping for breath. Breaking out in a cold sweat, the old man respectfully addressed him as the head of the Yu sect. He only smiled fiercely in the semi-darkness and mockingly suggested that the young master also go get help. No extra words were needed. The uninvited guests immediately hurried to leave. Before disappearing, the elder nervously wished him a safe journey. The man silently stood and listened to their footsteps. As soon as they were alone, he quietly addressed the beaten Kui. The teacher firmly promised, if anyone dares to go after her again, let him act as he sees fit, and he will take all the consequences upon himself. The dirty and scratched young man froze with a confused look. Only now did it occur to him. He had never truly understood his teacher. Before his eyes floated a sunlit hall where the three of them, still children, bowed before the mentor. That damn puppy maliciously sounded somewhere else. Against the backdrop of a crimson sunset stood the leader of the enemy faction with his people. His beaten subordinate justified himself. He deliberately provoked the Sangoman students. The goal was simple: to break their spirit, leave the sect without Yu Hyunjin, and get rid of the threat forever. The leader darkened, recalling the piercing gaze of the boy. If the kid with such eyes leads Songyamun, they are doomed. The man suddenly froze. He muttered something quietly, and a heavy dark aura spread in the air. A predatory smile spread across the mustached man's face. It was time to send the request. The night darkness enveloped the quiet estate of the Sunhui Gate. The young man relaxed, throwing his hands behind his head, lying on the bed in the dimly lit room. He laughed quietly, recalling his master's recent threat. He could not have imagined that someone would dare to cause such a commotion within their walls. But now he only enjoyed noting how quickly everyone got scared. The boy laughed sincerely, acknowledging the unexpected power of the master. His mood changed sharply, and he turned to the wall. Earlier, he planned to endure everything alone like a fool, but now he was tired of suffering from guilt. Previously, he silently endured everything alone, closing his eyes. But he was already tired of living with a constant feeling of guilt. There was a rustle behind the door and a timid request to enter. The young man immediately sat up on the bed and called his younger brother to come in. His face immediately lit up with a warm smile. The door slid aside, and a young apprentice froze timidly on the threshold. The elder patted the bed beside him and asked if everything was all right, to which the boy, stammering, hastily assured that he was fine. However, the apprentice did not move from his place, anxiously asking if the elder himself was in any pain. He clenched his fist until it cracked. The long-haired youth whispered weakly that he was dying, and his companion nearly turned gray with horror, choking out for a doctor. Instead, the sick one suddenly burst out laughing and cheerfully sat up. It was just a merciless joke. For a moment, everything froze. The elder, with a warm smile, patted the frightened boy on the crown and quietly thanked him. And then the boy suddenly grabbed his hand firmly. The youth smiled softly, realizing that for the first time in his 2 lives, he was seeing such sincere devotion. The apprentice blushed with pride and exclaimed inspiredly that he would definitely become just like his master. The elder only blinked confusedly. The boy took a fighting stance, burning with youthful enthusiasm, while the mentor silently sat in a stupor. In a moment, the boy sharply turned around and ran away, leaving him alone in the dimly lit room. A confused question flashed through his mind. Why fate chose him? He rushed through the night corridors as fast as he could, until suddenly he froze in place. The boy had been used to beatings since childhood because he was an ordinary beggar. A powerful kick with a run-up threw him backward. He curled up painfully on the ground, coughing from the pain. In the darkness, 3 threatening figures loomed over him. Of course, there was no one to protect the boy. Older boys mercilessly beat him with their feet, demanding he give up all the food begged for during the day. He only silently covered his battered head with his hands. That was his whole life. Now the boy cautiously crept through the noisy evening market, a beggar ready for anything. Just to survive, his gaze clung with a death grip to the tight wallet on the belt of an inattentive passerby. The battered hand weakly reached for the stranger's belt. The boy fell to the ground, freezing before the predatory red eyes in the darkness. Cold sweat rolled down his cheek. This is how he first met his teacher. The impassive man silently extended his hand to the frightened boy. But this clan never became his home. The night silence was shattered by a fierce scream, accusing him of attacking younger students. The angry older brother loomed over him, while he obediently averted his gaze. A heavy memory dissipated over the morning estate, along with a long yawn. The young man sat relaxed on the bed. He did not expect the wounds to heal in just 4 days. He clenched his fist, realizing that this was the direct merit of the secret inner art of Manhwa. Suddenly, the door to the room slammed open. A soot-covered younger apprentice froze in the doorway and stared in shock at the second senior. The young man gently wiped the dirt from his cheek and warmly asked if the boy had tried cooking again. The young man blinked, covered in soot, and blushed deeply. He awkwardly muttered that he just wanted to add a smoky flavor to the food. The elder only sighed, noting that going that far was completely unnecessary. He sent the boy to wash up before breakfast, but the boy rushed off with frantic energy to chop wood and carry water, and the mentor only watched this hyper-diligence in confusion. The boy watched his back with a tense, almost fanatical gaze. The memory clarified everything. The young man once slipped that the elder was the first to take their side. Chekva then just froze in surprise, and the little one, with clenched fists, fervently swore to grow up and become his exact copy. However, this emotional confession came exactly when he accidentally burned a huge hole in his clothes during washing. Remembering how Chekva awkwardly smiled through the burnt rags, the elder understood everything. He closed his eyes with relief. In this life, his choice was right. Startled by the unexpected call, he shuddered and sharply turned around, almost colliding with Chekva. Immediately relaxing, he smiled warmly and offered the girl to braid her hair before eating, which made her shine with joy. Someone's hand firmly squeezed his palm, giving a long-awaited feeling of peace. The young man smiled gently. Now he could finally live carefree alongside his younger pupils. Holding hands, they walked slowly towards the dazzling light. Flash, and the entire estate was suddenly engulfed by roaring flames. He looked around in shock in the middle of the hellish fire, completely not understanding where the fire came from. His face twisted with horror as he barely whispered an address to the elder. Complete darkness. On the burning floor lay bodies of students pierced by swords, and someone's bloodied hand was futilely reaching out in a plea for rescue. The young man froze, helplessly looking at the destroyed friends. Suddenly, the wall of fire struck him directly, sharply knocking him off his feet. The unbearable heat burned his skin. With a loud wheeze, he suddenly opened his eyes. It was only a dream. Confused, he found himself lying in his own bed. But as soon as the young man tried to calm down, a terrifying shadow with glowing eyes loomed over him from the darkness of the room. From the dense crimson darkness emerged a question. Did he wake up? Deaf silence became the only response. A shadow silently jumped down from the ceiling, right into the room of the sleeper. He suddenly opened his eyes, just as it seemed that everything was finally getting better. Smiling faces of loved ones flashed through his memory. He himself had changed the past he so regretted. Trembling fingers helplessly clutched the blanket. The young man was sure that this life would become much better. But the body froze, poison. Above the bed already loomed a stranger, mockingly saying that it would have been better if he had quietly died in his sleep. In the darkness, a blade gleamed coldly. The killer arrogantly stepped on the edge of the bed, The victim still could not move. His eyes narrowed, predatory for the final blow. The sword whistled as it plunged into the mattress, but the young man with an incredible jerk fell to the floor a moment before death. He twisted painfully, clutching his chest. Old wounds made it hard to breathe. The attacker looked around in surprise, not understanding how the paralyzed man managed to dodge. The young man was gasping for air on the cold wood, realizing that the dose of Chokbi's paralytic powder was insufficient. Lying surrounded by flickering blue energy, he felt his body obey him again. The assassin above confidently declared that the victim would not take another step. The boy was feverishly thinking, in a direct fight with a professional mercenary, he stood no chance. He opened his mouth, preparing to scream, but to the mentor's safe bedroom, a full 150 steps. Silence. A heavy boot stepped even closer. With bloodshot eyes flashing, the killer finished him off with the fact, but to the younger sister's room, only 20 steps. The young man weakly growled through his teeth, calling the enemy a freak. The mercenary mockingly agreed that a scream would indeed attract the attention of the powerful master. But before his appearance, the blade will manage to cut the throat of the sleeping child. The enemy suggested to him simply to quietly accept death. Cornered, the young man realized with horror that this was the only way to save her. His fist clenched on the floor with a crunch. The young man pressed to the floor, breathing heavily and thinking feverishly. How could he have trusted anyone at all? Above him loomed a mercenary, an unknown killer who cold-bloodedly ordered him to die with dignity. The sharp blade of the dagger mercilessly moved downward, but instead of accepting death, the boy sharply dove under the enemy's arm. With a jerk forward, he crashed into the mercenary's legs, knocking him off balance. The young man realized that he needed to strike the legs, and he clung tightly to the heavy metal stand on the floor. The tension reached its limit. The killer gasped in shock, not understanding how he was still moving, before the metal crushed his bone with a crunch. The boy was probably hitting, realizing if he maims this freak now, he will harm no one else. The space was torn by a wild scream of pain. "And now the second one!" roared the young man with a wild look, cutting off the mercenary's pitiful curses. The metal again whistled as it cut through the air. A powerful blow threw the killer back, crashing him into the floor. The wounded young man grabbed his head and quietly cursed the stubborn opponent. The killer in the mask clenched the dagger and growled that only because of the contract, he would not make him beg for death. The boy sank heavily, holding his bloodied hand, but barely smiled. His plan worked. The mercenary loomed over him and raised the blade for the final strike. The young man calmly closed his eyes, confident that even after his death, his comrades would be safe. A sudden flash, and the air was torn by the sound of sliced flesh. The boy confusedly opened one eye. The killer froze in place, and a thin, bloody streak slowly appeared on his neck. Blood gushed from the slit throat. A surprised look. The heavy body of this mercenary crashed to the floor with a thud, and the invisible savior calmly asked if the young man was intact. Behind the corpse stood a male figure with a sword. "Teacher?" he gasped in shock, recognizing a familiar face in the darkness. The mentor sharply narrowed his eyes, assessing the situation. On the floor in a pool of blood lay a corpse, and the bloodied Kvi collapsed nearby, exhausted but miraculously surviving the attack. The mentor fiercely gritted his teeth, looking at the bloodied student. The boy tried to speak, but the master interrupted him and mutely ordered him to follow. Noticing the student's shock, he threw over his shoulder that he must act like a real teacher at least once. His face hardened with determination. They silently moved through the night courtyard. Hui tensed, realizing that the path led straight into the territory of the Shagon gang, to Guaksahu. Only these thugs had a motive to send a hired killer after him, but they had no direct evidence. The master suddenly froze and clenched his fist with a crunch. He quietly called Hui, and under the moonlight firmly declared that today he would teach him one of the sword techniques. The mention of a past life puzzled the young man. Back then, he had spent a whole year studying the sword of heavenly will. He looked at the mentor in surprise, not understanding the reason for such haste. The master grimly admitted that he had dreamed of never passing this technique to his students. Looking into the darkness of the night courtyard, he decided to show it right now. The boy froze. He swallowed convulsively, hearing the stern order to watch, feel, and forever engrave what he saw into his soul. For a moment, the man smiled warmly, sincerely hoping that the young man would never have to follow in his footsteps. After that, he turned around and silently walked into the darkness. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a wildly powerful swing of a blade. A commotion arose. Frightened guards shouted about an attack by a stranger. One of the fighters pointed a spear, demanding the unknown to identify himself. A heavy boot struck the stone sharply, raising a cloud of dust before the lunge. A tall warrior emerged from the thick smoke, shielding the frightened girl with his body. He looked down coldly at the armed guards and ordered in an icy tone, to deliver a message to their leader. The man's eyes gleamed fiercely. He announced that the clan leader Songjiman himself had come. In the night fog, a lone swordsman stepped right in front of the armed guard before the massive gates. His young apprentice Kivi paled, realizing that there could be no talk of any peace negotiations. With a crash, the fragments flew apart. The master brazenly broke down the main gates and entered openly. The man calmly looked around and briefly ordered Kivi to watch closely. He took a firm step forward towards the spears of the guards. A thin streak of blood suddenly appeared on the neck of one of the enemies. He touched the wound in confusion. The beginning is always hidden in stillness, the master said calmly. Kivi froze, recognizing the movement. It was the drawing of the sword, the first stance of the sword of heavenly will. The boy realized the promise to teach the art meant a live lesson right in battle, and the master was already summoning the power of lightning. A dazzling golden pillar of energy pierced the darkness. It was the devastating strike of the falling sword. The swordsman's eyes flared crimson, and he instantly moved into a sharp horizontal sweep, the spreading of the earth. A gigantic whirlwind of wind and blades tossed the guards into the air, mercilessly shredding their bodies. The young man froze in the middle of the smoke. Everything was unfolding exactly according to the scenario he had studied in his past life. The surviving enemies panicked and fled, shouting to call the leader. Sweat rolled down the boy's face. Could this really be the true power of his master? But this was only the beginning. The mentor held the blade unflinchingly, and the space around began to rapidly heat up. A lightning-fast thrust left a bloody trail. Along with it came a piercing cold. The master relentlessly moved forward, carelessly cutting through opponents, while deadly energies intertwined around him. A flash, and streams of fire and yin merged into a single devastating vortex. The apprentice held his breath. All his life he had considered this sword style ordinary and absolutely unremarkable. And now the massive aura of the blade alone was turning the entire Shagan gang to dust. The realization struck like an electric shock. This is the sword of heavenly will. Walking through the blood-stained yard, the young man finally understood why 4 influential sects were so desperately seeking a meeting with his teacher. Matching his pace, he realized, today he saw his true power for the first time. The man sharply looked back and ordered him to step aside. Heavy, rhythmic footsteps were heard. From the darkness emerged the grim leader of the Songjimun sect, tightly gripping a pair of axes in his hands. His eyes flared red as he roared about the terrible crime. Frightened, Hui called out to the mentor, but he only calmly spoke his name. Amid the threat, Sahu calmly asked if the student understood the true essence of the Sword of Heavenly Will. Hui was confused, as the moment was completely inappropriate for lectures. Sahu did not care. Their technique embodies the laws of heaven, but the sword is always held by an ordinary person. And if a completely new path is forged in this art, it will turn into his own unique weapon. Tension hung in the air. Armed enemies had already tightly closed the ring around the two of them. The sect leader finally went mad from their calm and shouted that they would not leave here alive after attacking his people. A huge axe blocked the way, but the guest did not even blink and calmly demanded his debt. The mustached leader snorted contemptuously. The golden blade mercilessly pointed at him. The master slowly descended from the heavens, gripping the weapon he dreamed of never having to take up. He landed heavily right in the center of the enemy crowd. The guards recoiled fearfully from the wave of dust. The swordsman harshly accused them of attacking the great disciple of the Songjimun school. The swordsman added with icy calm that as a mentor he could not remain indifferent, and directly accused the mustached man of sending assassins to the disciple. The mustached man nervously swallowed and sharply asked for evidence. The guest coldly cut off, saying there is no evidence after all. He came here immediately, under the outraged cries of the bandits. The leader with an axe stepped forward, angrily reproaching the swordsman for the beaten people. He again confidently grinned. Without evidence, the right is on the side of the gang, so the guests better leave immediately. The warrior with an axe shouted through the smoke that without evidence they have nothing to do here. Thick fog swirled underfoot. The dark-haired man turned away indifferently, promising to spare his life due to old connections, but to make him answer for this day. He quietly snorted. Then he covered his face with his hand and laughed loudly, completely confusing the enemy. A sinister dark aura enveloped his figure as he coldly said that this is the fate of the living, not the dead. The big guy barely managed to blink in confusion. A moment, and a swift, bloody slash like lightning cut across his chest. The devastating force of the blow threw the body backward. Heavy axes slipped powerlessly from hands. He collapsed to the ground, never understanding where the attack came from, while his companions screamed in horror. The witness froze, shocked by the inhuman strength of Yu Hyunjun. The swordsman's eye flashed fiercely in the darkness, and he delivered the final verdict. Today, the Shagan gang will disappear forever from Ansan County. He lunged forward with a fierce jerk, cutting through the thick fog. A flash of crimson energy, and the enemy was thrown back with a ripped-open chest. A wide swing of the sword tore through the air, mercilessly sweeping opponents off the path. The space trembled from the heavy blow. The girl froze at what she saw. Amid the smoke stood the silhouette of the master. His movement of the sword of heavenly will drove the surviving enemies into animal terror. A new devastating swing of the blade turned everything around into a bloody massacre. Although more precisely, into an absolute slaughter, where the bodies of the opponents were simply torn to pieces. A figure shrouded in darkness with burning eyes looked like the embodiment of disaster itself. Suddenly, the girl's body flared with a blue aura. Her art man, he involuntarily reacted to this foreign power. She tensed, finally clearly feeling the nature of his power thanks to the resonance. All this fog turned out to be pure released energy of the master. Chi was so dense that it took physical form and tore people apart at a distance, even without the touch of a blade. A dazzling cross-shaped explosion tore through the darkness, demonstrating a level of combat mastery beyond any standards. A destructive whirlwind swept across the battlefield, forcing the survivors to scream about a monster in panic and flee for their lives. The commander desperately tried to hold the formation, fiercely shouting at his men to come to their senses immediately. Suddenly, a sharp whistle sounded, and he froze stunned. Nearby, two other warriors tensed anxiously, peering into the thick dust. The young man turned pale with horror, unable to utter a word. A bloody flash, and the body of the senior warrior was suddenly cut in half. Huh? He only breathed out with an empty gaze, never realizing his own death. The wounded man froze in shock over the fallen body. He clenched his teeth with a crunch. The space was torn by a furious roar as a colossal whirlwind of crimson energy surged. The enraged father lunged forward, spitting curses. His axe sliced the air with a bloody crescent, vainly seeking a target. A thick fog enveloped the battlefield. Crossing weapons, the gang leader Shagin shouted, demanding the killer of his son to come into the light. His eyes filled with blood. With a wild roar, he began blindly tearing the smoke around him. Suddenly, through this veil, someone's silhouette appeared. The leader moved heavily forward, instantly making him a new target. The young man cursed in his mind. The enemy decided to vent his anger on him instead of the mentor. The enraged leader rushed into attack, unleashing a devastating blow on the boy with both axes. A sharp whistle of sliced air. Understanding the chasm in strength, the youth tensed to the limit. He had only one way out left. He focused his gaze, desperately trying not to miss a single movement of Guaxahu. His body acted on instinct, and he miraculously dodged the wide, devastating swing. The big guy snarled irritably, calling him a pathetic rat. But the next moment, his own chest was cut by a lightning-fast strike, sending a fountain of blood into the air. Coughing up crimson, he heavily sank to the ground and, through the smoke, recognized the head of the gates, Sun Wei. Master. The youth exhaled with relief. A tall figure with a bare sword slowly emerged from the thick dust. The master loomed over the fallen enemy and coldly asked if this merciless blade was truly his chosen path. The big guy could only tremble with horror, rapidly bleeding out. Around them stretched a field of corpses. Dozens of slain fighters already lay in puddles. Realizing the scale of the slaughter, Guaxahu desperately shouted, not believing that the mentor had arranged all this carnage just for one mercenary. The old man spat a clot of black blood, looking at his killer with fierce shock. With a sharp whistle, the sword descended for the final blow. A fountain of blood splashed onto the hands and weapon of the victor. The warrior's face was completely smeared with crimson as he calmly asked if she had watched carefully. The girl in white stood among the bloodied bodies and barely audibly confirmed it. A heavy sadness was reflected in her blue eyes. Surveying the site of the massacre, she quietly admitted that it was too sad. The man only barely smiled. They had slaughtered all the enemies in just one night. Dawn slowly illuminated the roofs of the ancient city. The Shagan gang ceased to exist forever in Onsen County. Far away from there, in a gloomy hall among dozens of lit candles, someone was meditating on a dais. It was a man whose face was hidden by a terrifying mask of a red demon. Suddenly, the flames around him flared sharply and brightly. Meanwhile, deep in the shadows, the man in the red demonic mask meditated before a black candle, exhaling clouds of dark energy. With cold irritation, he admitted, in Ansan County, one of their seeds had vanished without a trace, apparently Guak Cholu from the local gang. He recalled the generous payment the sect had received when they once sheltered that boy. Behind him, like a phantom, appeared the image of a respectable father beside a small son. The silence was suddenly broken by a voice from the shadows asking if he still remembered. The man quietly confirmed this, and the candle flame barely flickered. The sectarian laughed hoarsely, refusing to believe that the heir of a powerful faction could have died so foolishly alone, and vowed to check everything. But the interlocutor sharply cut him off. Most likely the elusive sword Sununjian also wanders Anson. In the darkness, a gloomy face emerged. To a blind man, this swordsman was too cruel, persistent, and relentless. A heavy question hung in the air. Would they really just leave him alone? The masked man barely restrained his rage. Because of this warrior, they had already lost a bunch of their pawn nails, and now they had also paid with a valuable seed. No one intended to forgive such a thing. The man in the crimson demonic mask thoughtfully rubbed his chin. He ordered his subordinate not to touch the blind man. The grand plan was reaching its final stretch, and unnecessary moves could only scare the prey. He said they had enough nails, and then his eye flashed predatory from beneath the mask, hinting at something else. Echoes of ringing battle cries reached the dark hall, under which the leader calmly meditated. Hundreds of young students were synchronously practicing sword strikes. The sect had plenty of fresh seats. The man smiled smugly. These fools were walking right into his hands, not even suspecting their fate. Suddenly, violet flames flared above the candlestick. Another target appeared. He reached out to the magical fire and instantly recognized in it the energy of a child from the Huang'an family. Meanwhile, a tattered swordsman was walking across the dusty square of another city in the company of a little girl. Recalling the past, he suddenly admitted that he had once been a worthless scholar. The girl looked up in surprise at his blood-stained clothes, and the warrior explained that at least he could read and write. A slight smile touched his tired face. Thanks to literacy, he was able to get a job at the trade guild. It was there that he met a good woman, with whom he finally started a family. Once he smiled sincerely, tightly embracing his beloved wife. The girl thought with amazement that the mentor had once lived an ordinary life, far removed from the world of martial arts. Everything broke the moment people from the dark path approached him. Strangers demanded that he steal the guild's trade books, but he refused, and just a few days later his eyes widened in horror. And a few days after the refusal, a blood-red darkness fell upon his house. He lost his family forever. Crossing the threshold of his own home, the man froze before the shattered room, where his beloved lay in a crimson puddle. His wife was brutally killed, and the little son disappeared without a trace. "My wife!" With a despairing cry, he fell to his knees and lifted her into his arms. These were the same people from the dark past. Silence. He pressed the lifeless body to himself with a crunch, trembling with sobs. And it was then that he was completely and utterly overwhelmed by. It all began with a blind thirst for revenge. The man's face was distorted by despair, and tears rolled down his cheeks. He dreamed of only one thing: power. His gaze burned. He desperately needed martial arts. But there was one obstacle. At his age, it was already too late to begin training. No one wished to extend a helping hand. Everyone was indifferent to the destitute scientist. Hope was slowly fading. Everything changed when the tattered and bloodied man finally met his benefactor. The girl nearby quietly uttered the word manhwa, and he mutely confirmed it with a nod. That day he received ancient treatises in a mystical glow. The techniques of manhwa and zhonghui, the very will of heaven. One night, the swordsman received a tattered martial arts manual from the old scientist. He confessed that he had found it a long time ago in an old bookstore. The warrior gloomily examined the old volumes. It was a book of completely unknown origin. The new technique became his obsession. He honed sword strikes for hours, raising powerful whirlwinds. Suddenly, a sharp attack. He clutched his chest, from which pulsating red light burst forth. An explosion of crimson energy struck directly from his body, shredding his clothes. He bent over in half, coughing up blood heavily. This power had more than once brought him to the edge. On the very edge of death, his strength was exhausted, and he fell face down into the dirt helplessly. Weakened fingers unclenched the hilt. But even that could not stop him. The exhausted swordsman fell to one knee in the middle of the forest, barely holding on to his weapon and spitting out blood. Because if he cannot take revenge, then it is better to simply die. With a wild roar, he broke through his own limits, exploding with a crimson aura. From the powerful surge of force, a frightened flock of birds took to the sky. Shrouded in hot smoke, he staggered but forced himself to stand up. Dark energy pulsed in sharp lines near his eye as sweat rolled down his face. Perhaps that is why he finally managed to unlock his sea of energy. He stared distrustfully at his own scarred and trembling palm, from which steam was still rising, and to comprehend the heavenly intention. It was this that showed him the way of Helche. He clenched his fist until the knuckles turned white. Helche meant a blood debt and a grievance washed away only by blood. Shrouded in thick smoke, the swordsman froze amid the ruins. He personally destroyed the dark sect, the very one that took away his family, and then tracked down the puppeteer, closing the endless vicious circle of death. Having wiped out 5 dark sects, he forever engraved his new name into the memory of the world: sword that pierces the clouds. Beside the apprentice, the man bitterly admitted, his blade was truly soaked with pain, for revenge brought no peace, only emptiness and terrible news of his son's death. The warrior closed his eyes, recalling lost warmth, a smiling wife with an infant in her arms. Silence. Together with the girl, he silently moved toward the gates, leaving the ghosts of the past behind. Covered in soot and blood, the warrior suddenly stopped and shook his shoulder. He warmly smiled at the confused young man. A heavy hand gently rested on the student's head. The master quietly confessed that before their meeting, he did not want to live at all. That very day came to mind, the empty gaze of an exhausted child, to whom he then reached out his hand. The boy froze, shocked by the words that it was he who gave the master a chance for a new life. The man opened his scarred palm, calling the student his savior and swearing to always protect him. Seeing the mentor smile, the boy barely held back tears. After all, in his past life, he only hated him for his coldness. The youth was overwhelmed by burning shame for never noticing another's pain behind the mask of an invincible swordsman. "Let's go inside," the master said, and the student finally smiled sincerely. Shouting his agreement loudly, he felt the stone finally fall from his soul. Later, they met in the middle of the school's spacious courtyard. Already washed and changed into clean clothes, the mentor confidently held a weapon in his hands. He handed the student his first owned sword. Though not legendary, it was enough to grasp the will of the heavens. The boy clenched the sword, mentally rejoicing that this start was radically different from his past life. The mentor calmly ordered to demonstrate the technique of the will of the heavens. The student immediately agreed, although the teacher indulgently added that forgetting the techniques is not a sin. The young man confidently took a fighting stance. The man crossed his arms, carefully watching how the student prepared for the strike. Suddenly, a predatory, excited smile flashed across the boy's face. Forget? He honed this art to his last breath. Even if he did not reach the absolute peak then. The space exploded with a blue aura, and with a wild scream, he unleashed the true will of the heavens forward. The mentor was stunned. The blade whistled as it cut through the air, leaving behind a powerful, energetic trail. He exhaled heavily, lowering his hand onto the hilt, and soon the young man was rushing full speed along the mountain path, exhaustedly gasping for air through his mouth. He suddenly stopped, hearing a surprised brother's call behind him. "Rest," the voice sounded, while the boy wearily closed his eyes, dripping with sweat. The realization of his own weakness struck instantly. He blushed deeply, mentally crying out in shame. His vision darkened. With a fierce battle cry, he lunged forward, putting the last of his strength into a sword swing, around which a blue aura flared. And then the weapon simply slipped from his hands, leaving an expression of absolute shock on his face. The wooden blade spun pointlessly in the air. The mentor did not even blink. With a habitual movement, he caught the weapon midair. The boy dragged his feet on the ground, raising a cloud of dust, and froze before the motionless teacher. When the mentor bitterly admitted that he lacked the experience for such a student, the boy burst into tears, begging forgiveness for his worthlessness. The teacher only smiled warmly and said that to start, he would have to strengthen his weak bodies. And now he was already running laps around the yard. He was horrified by the thought that due to his own clumsiness, he had almost killed the mentor with the sword that flew from his hands. With groans of exhaustion, he ran further and further, firmly resolved to stick to the training plan. Younger students watched this marathon in confusion, having no idea what fly had stung their older brother. The episode began. The young man was gasping heavily with a sword in his hands when a stern voice reminded him that without a strong foundation of skill, one cannot succeed. The boy turned around fearfully. A man came out to meet him and warned that excessive exhaustion would only harm the body. His black cloak barely moved. The student immediately straightened up, recognizing his mentor. The man quietly snorted into his fist, examining his drenched protege. He ordered the young man to quickly wash up and change clothes for a joint trip. The boy turned pale, suspecting that the master had revealed the truth about the Shagon gang. But then the destination was announced. Songra. The student could not believe his ears, but the mentor clearly repeated the name. The young man froze in shock, already imagining the red silk curtains and golden pins of this entertainment establishment. The stunned boy repeated the name of that place with his own lips. In front of them stood the house of Kaizen, full of musicians and guests, and the young man asked confusedly if the mentor was really taking him there. The mentor remarked with a slight smile that the boy knew too much. The apprentice pointed at himself confusedly with his finger, reminding that he was only 14, but the man just laughed heartily. The young man even broke out in a sweat from indignation. Although in this life they had become closer, who in their right mind would go to have fun in the house of Kaisen with their own teacher? The man innocently asked if he refused to keep him company. The boy could only resignedly bow and agree. A brief moment of silence. Dragging himself through the yard, the apprentice sighed heavily. The mentor's order is not to be discussed. Meanwhile, in a completely different place, worn scrolls were laid on the table, and a woman's voice tiredly admitted, This time, the uncle outdid himself. Above the papers stood a beauty in luxurious attire, thoughtfully holding a pipe. From the darkness emerged an illuminated sign, Songru. This was not a cheap house of debauchery, but a real palace, bathed in the warm light of lanterns. However, the courtesans of Songru traded only in laughter, music, and art, not their own bodies. In the night air, crimson sparks lazily swirled. The young man blinked in confusion. For their remote Ansan County, the establishment looked far too elite. The boy was embarrassed. Coming here together with his mentor was a dubious pleasure. The stern, long-haired teacher approached the owner and directly stated that they had come to the lady. The woman smoothly indicated the way. The mentor confidently moved forward, and the student followed closely, hiding behind his broad back. They froze before the closed doors, and the guide reported the arrival of guests from Songyamun. In the semi-darkness, painted lips barely moved. The mistress of the room ordered them to be let in. The guide, with a polite smile, offered the man a drink. The mentor and the student silently stepped forward. The boy exclaimed in confusion, and the man stopped abruptly. They were greeted by the luxurious owner of Songru, who slyly noted the appearance of the unusual couple. The boy was stunned to realize that in his past life, he had no idea about the mentor's connection to Songru, and still did not believe that the poor sex Songyamun was linked to such a luxurious house of pleasures. The young man pondered, could it be that the master always brought piles of silver from here? While the boy marveled at her youth, Vohyun greeted them and then immediately offered the mentor a job. She playfully called his talent wasted, to which the man dryly retorted that men did not interest him. The student was taken aback by such straightforwardness. The hostess of the establishment lost her speech for a moment. She squinted irritably, assessing the sharp tongue of the master. Suddenly, the woman burst into a ringing laugh, recalling local rumors about the incredible kindness of the senior student. Her mocking smile only confirmed what was said. The boy darkened. For a fighter, a reputation for kindness was a stigma, and meant that the whole city considered him a naive fool. Majim confidently warned his companion that from now on, everything would change. The young man himself guessed that he was brought here not for the courtesans, until suddenly the hostess of the establishment playfully called Makim uncle. The boy blinked in confusion. However, the woman immediately dismissed the jokes and sternly stated that the guest had gone too far. She still could not understand how he managed to single-handedly cut down the entire Shagan gang in one night. Majim calmly replied that he had good reasons for this, after which the courtesan asked if they would again cover up the traces. She impatiently tapped her fingers on the table, suggesting this time to spread rumors. The woman assured if they agreed to this, it would not take half a day before the whole city knew the truth. The night streets would quickly fill with whispers, and everyone would learn that the mysterious killer Shofeng was Magim. It turned out that for the destroyed gang, this was already the second contract, and the first happened many years ago involving the wife of the clan leader Sovan. It turned out that the first such contract was made many years ago. Then the third wife of the clan leader, Savan, who came from the Pan family, died. Weighing the risks, the woman still advised to hide the information, but Magim firmly ordered to spread the rumors. Her eyes widened in shock from such a surprise. The young man fearfully called out to the uncle, who confidently slapped the document on the table in front of the hostess. The woman only smiled slyly while the boy was drenched in cold sweat. She wearily fell into the armchair. Everything was clear. This game started for the sake of the little one. The young man was as if struck by electricity. Songru turned out to be a real guild of informants. He grabbed his head, not understanding why in the past life the uncle hid this secret until the very end. The young man feverishly wondered why in the past life the mentor hid the true essence of Songru from him until the very end. The man stood with an impassive smile while the boy feverishly searched for the reason for such sudden frankness. A heavy sigh, and the woman gave up. She sharply poked him with her finger. He takes all the dealings with the Shagan gang upon himself, and the shares are divided 7-3. The uncle nodded indifferently, reminding that they would have to grease a few more fat pigs on their side. The hostess puffed her cheeks irritably in response to his dry thank you. Suddenly, the man stepped aside, turning all his attention to his nephew. Volkian, I have a request for you, he declared, leaving the boy blinking in confusion. The woman ordered the young man to stay in place. Meanwhile, the elder man silently walked away, and the boy called out to him in confusion from behind. The heavy door slammed shut with a crash. Left alone with the hostess, he shouted in panic. She coldly interrupted the hysteria with a single command to sit down. Hot drink poured into a clay bowl. The woman with the pipe unequivocally ordered him to drink. He nervously sipped, listening as she said, "This place earns money by trading information." Her gaze pierced through the smoke as she spoke about the secrets they had gathered. The hostess added that such information they usually only pass on to his mentor. An indulgent smile played on her face, leaving no room for arguments. And then suddenly polite words of apology were heard directed at the client. The woman leaned over him and reminded that in their craft, any secrets must be paid for. "How am I supposed to pay?" The young man tensed under her attentive gaze. She openly mocked his hopelessness, but made an exception and allowed one free question. He swallowed hard and quietly thanked. The woman leaned back relaxedly, fully understanding that he was seeking the truth about her relationship with his mentor. They were bound together by an old shared wound, through which they still needed each other. She squinted intently and asked how much he had already managed to find out. The young man laid out everything: the failed scholar's exam, working as a merchant, and his past with his family. Receiving a confirming nod about revenge, the woman understood the conversation would proceed faster. Her face instantly became cold and serious. It was the trading company that saved his mentor on the brink of death when he was fleeing from the burning hell. And then the woman confessed that she was the biological daughter of that very trading lord. The boy turned to stone from what he heard. Two men were fleeing from the burning estate. It was the same trading guild that once pulled their mentor back from the other world. The woman said directly that she was the biological daughter of the head of that very trading guild. The young man froze from surprise. The puzzle came together. That was why she called him uncle, although they were not blood relatives. He asked why the daughter of the guild head worked in such a place, to which the woman replied with a slight smile that they had gone bankrupt. In his memories, that night flared up again. Right after Uncle left, the estate was attacked, and she barely escaped with the guild treasury, dooming herself to long wanderings. She closed her eyes. From that day on, she was driven only by the thirst for revenge. Opening the Kaizen house in Ansan, the woman plied men with drinks to loosen their tongues and extract secrets. And that was how she once again found their mentor. She playfully pointed at the interlocutor. He listened to her, stunned by what he heard. The boy recalled his past life. The mentor never spoke about himself to protect the students from the same joyless, pain-soaked sword. The young man clenched his clothes with a crunch. Now it became clear why the teacher was silent about Songru. Everything fell into place. This story was closely connected with his past as well. The young man bowed low across the table, sincerely thanking Lady Vulcan for opening his eyes. But the woman gently objected. In fact, she was the one indebted to him. A warm, calm smile flashed across her face. She admitted that she had always considered her uncle defenseless until Songimon saved him. Looking at his reflection in the cup of tea, Vulcan revealed the main secret. The uncle himself ordered the rumors to be spread that he single-handedly destroyed the cruel Shigang gang. The young man was as if struck by electricity. Not believing what he heard, he sharply jumped up, slamming his hands on the table with a crash. Blindly believing street rumors turned out to be a big mistake. The hostess calmly leaned back with a cup in her hand. Now the puzzle came together. The successor of Songi Moon is not a fool at all, but a mentor from Ansan County has started a large-scale game. This unexpected maneuver meant only one thing. He is preparing to openly challenge the entire Morim. The world had already begun to forget how the mentor once personally eliminated 5 dark sects. But this step was meant to harshly remind everyone of his true power. She confidently stated that now no one would dare to touch either him or Songomon's students. As confirmation, shredded bodies of enemies lay nearby. Anyone who risks it will bring upon themselves the devastating wrath of her uncle. The young man grimly realized that this way, the mentor would end up in a trap. All those who harbored malice and thirst for revenge against him would begin to gather strength to one day fight back. The young man nervously swallowed, quietly cursing. The woman stood up from the table and decided to end the conversation, realizing that she had already said too much and now she would definitely get it. She smiled arrogantly, convinced that the boy had no more questions. But when she was already opening the window, he suddenly broke the silence, asking to answer one more question. The woman cast a cold glance at him over her shoulder. She froze. Gathering his will into a fist, the young man directly asked if the revenge of his mentor was really completed. The woman slowly turned to him with her whole body. A predatory, self-satisfied smile spread across her lips. "And what do you think?" she said mockingly, piercing the boy with an icy gaze. The full moon shone indifferently over the night estate. Breathing heavily, he rushed headlong into the darkness. Suddenly, pain made him hunch over. Old wounds were still bleeding. He clenched his teeth to the point of grinding. With a desperate scream, the boy ran again. Strength waned, and a bitter thought flashed that it would have been better if he had just stayed lying down. He mentally scolded himself for his own weakness. dripping with cold sweat. Frequent disappearances of the mentor and the cold woman from their marriage of convenience surfaced in his memory. His leg buckled. With a dull thud, he collapsed to the ground. Lying face down and barely catching his breath, he made a single conclusion for himself. All the unnecessary vanished. His fist struck the ground with fury. The mentor's revenge was not yet complete. The apprentice sank heavily to the ground, scolding himself for once again becoming burdened. A tear of helplessness rolled down his cheek. He saw how the master was pushing himself again for his sake. Mentor, the boy quietly exhaled, noticing a familiar figure near the gates. He instantly sprang up and bowed respectfully. He immediately ordered to stop the exhausting training and smiled warmly. The boy flinched confusedly and then waved his hands, awkwardly justifying that he was about to finish anyway. The attempt to change the subject to dinner did not work. The teacher had already eaten, and now he was worried about something else. The mentor asked anxiously why he was exhausting himself so much when the wounds had not even healed yet, and the boy admitted that he simply wanted to become stronger as soon as possible. Looking at the sword stuck in the ground, the student silently swore never to put the master in danger again, although the master only laughed cheerfully, recalling the past trouble. The teacher calmly said not to worry about all this so much. The man gently placed his heavy palm on the boy's head and reminded him that he himself was perfectly capable of standing up for himself. In the darkness, his question sounded, hadn't he seen everything with his own eyes? The mentor in the black cloak walked away, and the student stopped confusedly behind. The man looked back with a confident smile and reminded about his strength. The young man smiled warmly in response and received the order to go rest. The teacher warned that he would leave again soon, and the boy respectfully bowed. He remained standing with his head bowed, a thought pierced with anxiety. Will the mentor endure if the entire bloody burden of the clan falls on his shoulders with sharp thorns? Silence. The young man moved into the darkness, vowing never to be a burden again. He stood alone in the middle of the night yard. Blue energy flared around his body in a powerful whirlwind. He was to become stronger. The space around trembled. Behind him, a bloodied shadow from a past life menacingly appeared. But this time he would forge a completely different path. Sun rays peacefully pierced through the leaves as he prepared to get to work. The young man carefreely sat by the stream, deciding to start with ordinary laundry. His face darkened. He mentally scolded himself for falling out of reality and leaving the dirty clothes for several days. He carefully unfolded the torn black fabric, which he had secretly carried past the younger ones, when suddenly the forest was torn by a loud scream. Chekva decisively advanced, heavily treading her steps towards him. The boy instantly broke out in nervous sweat and awkwardly tried to justify himself, reminding her that he had asked her to wait downstairs. The girl fiercely loomed over him with clenched fists, and he resignedly realized the peaceful morning was over. Problems were beginning. Early in the morning by the river, the girl sat next to her older brother, hesitating to speak for a long time. The girl barely held back tears. She called her older brother a fool and reproached him for trying in vain to hide everything from them. The boy anxiously raised his eyes, catching something heavy in her words. Suddenly, she froze in shock. Looking at her brother, she realized that the blood on his clothes belonged to the enemies, and whispered in despair that she was to blame for everything. Tears rolled down her cheeks as the girl confessed to fighting with the Shagan gang. Wiping her wet eyes, she bitterly added that it was because of her that he and the mentor had to enter the fight. The brother stood up to meet and quietly called Chekva by name. He gently stroked her head, wondering silently why the girl was so deeply worried. The brother softly assured her that he was only concerned about her fright and never thought she was to blame for anything. Through tears, the girl passionately objected that she would simply become very, very strong. At that moment, a fierce flame suddenly blazed in his eyes. From the sudden heat, the girl let out a comical squeal and jumped back in fear. The girl clung tightly to a stranger's back, remembering her father. He also died because of her. Before her eyes, the bloodied body surfaced again, awakening a burning hatred of her own helplessness. Clenching her fists, she loudly vowed to become stronger for the sake of her mentor and brothers. "No one will cry because of me anymore," the girl blurted out, and the boy agreed confusedly. He barely smiled, suddenly understanding why Chekva had left their school in her past life. She left because she could not protect her native sect. Before her departure, the girl was an ordinary fighter. Perhaps she simply could not bear to watch her friends suffer while shielding her. Suddenly, the little one turned around briskly and promised to ask the mentor for martial arts lessons, so that from now on she could protect her older brother herself. Behind this loud determination hid an ordinary, sincere child, to whom he could only quietly give thanks. The boy smiled warmly. The tension eased. He offered help with the laundry, but the girl waved him off. They continued to sit peacefully on the rocky shore under the quiet splash of water. The quiet splash of water broke the morning silence. The young man raised the wooden sword, firmly remembering one rule. Everything starts with the mood. He closed his eyes, finally understanding how easily ordinary routine turns into real training. Knowing his own ineptitude, the boy desperately struck the water with a stick, while the little companion silently sat nearby. If thoughts can change everything, he will not waste another moment. Sharp swing. Suddenly, a bright golden trail stretched from the stick, and the young man cried out in confusion. Dazzling flash. A powerful cross-shaped streak of energy tore through the river and shattered the stones to pieces. The girl, frightened, pressed herself against the rock, comically bulging her eyes. As soon as the splashes settled, she jumped up and began waving her arms excitedly, imitating the roar of an explosion. The boy sat pale from shock, not hearing her joyful screams at all. His hand trembled. He looked incredulously at the ordinary stick, realizing that he had just accidentally reproduced the legendary falling sword of heavenly will. Cold sweat appeared on his forehead. He had just used the technique of the sword of heavenly will with an ordinary laundry stick. The young man sprang from his place, flashing through the yard as a series of blurred silhouettes. He stopped, gasping heavily for air. A moment passed. In a few days, he still could not calm down, recalling his mishap to the point of exhaustion. No matter how much he waved the wooden stick in front of the astonished girl, the miracle did not repeat. However, his own mood changed during the daily running around. Chopping wood, sweeping, sewing, and cooking no longer seemed like hard labor. Grabbing the handle, he finally understood. All this household routine was continuous training. Confidence flashed in his eyes. Now he just needed to use these familiar movements to regain the feeling of flow. The boot firmly pressed into the ground. He rushed forward at a crazy speed, feeling how perfectly every muscle in his body worked in harmony, and immediately lost balance, clumsily stumbling on flat ground. The young man sank heavily near the rock, trying to catch his breath. He again started running through the yard, convinced that exhausting training would return his lost inspiration. Behind him came the sound of pounding feet. A trio of younger students was racing after him at full speed, joyfully encouraging their older brother. He smiled warmly at the little ones on the go. Everything around was constantly changing. He himself, these children, and their entire Songyamun sect. Suddenly, the whole company abruptly stopped. He wiped the sweat from his forehead and announced a break, allowing the exhausted students to finally breathe out. The young man called one of them, Tangoyul. The boy responded instantly. The elder asked him to help with sweeping, and the little one gladly agreed, slightly blushing from the attention. They together took up the brooms, since lately Tangoyul had been following him like a tail and wanted to do everything together. The young man leisurely waved the broom, sincerely enjoying these quiet moments with the children, from whom he had so absurdly distanced himself in his past life. The broom froze in his hands. He suddenly deeply realized how much he truly valued his fellow students. He admitted that back then he was simply exhausted and completely forgot about everything, while a ghostly mentor towered behind his back. The young man suddenly shuddered, as if something had caught his attention. The young man turned back to work and calmly swept the stone courtyard. He was stopped by a worried comrade, asking if everything was all right. He only smiled warmly, leaned on the broom, and advised not to worry. A brief moment of silence. The broom again methodically scraped over the tiles. Left alone, the young man silently moved the broom further, and his face darkened again. Suddenly, the young man froze. His face became sharp, and a bright aura began to rise from his body. He closed his eyes, letting the sparkling energy pass through him, catching every movement of the body and feeling his feet firmly rooted to the ground. His palm gripped the handle tighter. A sharp strike of the broom against the stone. He abruptly opened his eyes. His pupils narrowed from the sudden illumination. He smoothly swung that ordinary broom, and a shining arc trail flashed in the air. Thus was born the new path of the sword. The next strike cut it through space with the force of a true blade. The earth trembled, and before the young man, a giant pillar of energy burst into the sky. He did not stop, focusedly continuing his movement amid the whirlwind of dust. A powerful blow with the handle shattered the stone slabs beneath his feet. The young man smiled with satisfaction. This time he finally grasped the true essence of his sword, heavenly will. Absolute silence reigned in the dark room. The young man collapsed onto the bed exhausted, complaining of wild fatigue. Recently, ordinary household chores had closely intertwined in his mind with the principles of the sword. Washing or sweeping the yard, each action became continuous training, for everything turned out to be connected. Mind, routine, and sword mastery intertwined into one powerful mechanism. He calmly looked at the ceiling, realizing it is this unity that makes him who he is. At that very moment, thick streams of blue energy swirled around his body. A shining whirlwind with a roar broke through the roof and swiftly burst into the night sky. Lying in the epicenter of this storm, the boy recalled his past life, where he always felt like a stranger. A slight smile appeared on his face. Real life did indeed exist, both then and now. Suddenly, the door sharply slid open, and a surprised guest froze on the threshold, calling the older brother. For a moment, silence reigned. He touched his stomach, where a blue whirlwind shone. The inner energy had finally returned. A slight smile flashed on his face. Before his eyes still stood the memory of how this power shattered into pieces. He truly thought he had lost it forever. Walking down the corridor beside the younger apprentice, he pondered his core of strength, when suddenly the boy asked if he had grown taller. The young man froze in surprise. A troubling thought flashed through his mind. In his past life, he only began to grow after a year. The gaze slid down. The pants really had become noticeably too short. He confusedly pulled back the edge of the clothing, suspecting that such sharp changes were caused by the influence of Manhwa. And the little one was already excitedly tugging at his sleeve, naively deciding that the secret of rapid growth was hidden in daily yard cleaning. The boy's eyes lit up with considerable enthusiasm. He resolutely clenched his fists. Without listening to the end, the little one dashed down the corridor to immediately take up the broom, and the young man only helplessly stretched out his hand after him. The wind carried a dry leaf past his surprised face. The young man only smiled carefreely, waving his hand at it. The morning went according to the usual schedule. He swept the yard, fed the little ones, and now was running training laps. Breathing heavy, sweat pouring into his eyes, he sharply stopped in front of the children, who were already falling onto the grass exhausted. The girl tiredly complained that today they had run much more, and the brother agreed in surprise. Wiping sweat, he realized that all this was the technique of Manhwa. Having dropped to the ground, the young man felt how the inner energy incessantly absorbed chi, granting the body boundless endurance and sharp senses. This power quietly and continuously circulated within him by itself. A brief moment of silence. Looking at his palms, he was struck by the realization that the new physical strength had made his body mature overnight. Suddenly, he noticed the absence of Kohyun, and upon hearing that the little one had gone to dig in the earth, he felt the usual prick of anxiety. He could only nervously exhale in surprise. 3 students sharply turned around upon hearing the shout about the elder brother. Eyes widened. He immediately recognized this mighty chi. A little girl with a joyful scream rushed forward to meet him. The yard exploded with noise. Children ran to the gates, eagerly greeting the mentor at home. The young man and the girl respectfully folded their hands in the traditional gesture. Both students smiled broadly, not hiding their joy at his return. The man walked past them. He smiled kindly at the children. Then he stopped and silently looked at the young man. The latter mentally exhaled, reassured that the master had returned without a scratch. But he tensed instantly when the mentor broke the silence. "You have grown a lot," the man said softly. Shekva looked up with a warm but unwavering smile. The master calmly praised her brother for the exhausting training. The young man bowed and thanked quietly. The boy beamed from the long-awaited recognition, when suddenly his sister jumped out from behind his back. She loudly demanded to be taught martial arts as well. The mentor blinked in confusion. The brother was stunned. Not long ago, she was panic-stricken, afraid of this man, but now she was clenching her fists aggressively. In her emotions, the girl declared that she would personally finish off all the enemies so that her older brother would never have to do it again. At such bloodthirstiness, both of their eyes bulged, and the young man rushed to panic-strickenly cover her mouth. He leaned toward the mentor's ear and nervously whispered the explanation. The master was pierced by cold sweat from the realization. The child had seen their brutal massacre during the escape. He silently and firmly took both children by the hands. The girl clenched her palms and fervently begged to be made strong so that she could finally protect her brother and her new teacher. The man laughed warmly, sincerely amazed at how quickly these children had grown. He closed his eyes. The Sangyamun sect was supposed to be only a temporary refuge for him. His true home remained forever in that terrible day, among the bodies of the dead, where he was drowning in endless revenge. For years, he had simply gone with the flow of this bloody sea, but now everything was different. He lowered his gaze to the little ones who trustingly nestled at his feet. Now he definitely knew where he belonged and proudly accepted the role of their mentor. Looking at the bright smiles of the senior students, the man finally realized his duty and responsibility for their future. Suddenly, a cold sweat of shame broke over him. After all, he had shifted this entire burden onto Li Hui's shoulders. Mentally scolding himself for his pitifulness, the mentor resolutely announced the start of training the day after tomorrow morning. An excited children's shout rang out over the spacious green yard. The mentor mentally swore that this time he would not let the sword slip from his hands. for these children were free to choose their own path. A large palm gently tousled the hair of the senior students. The little ones joyfully and tightly embraced the mentor, evoking only a warm, carefree smile from him. The man smiled warmly and lifted the joyful little one into his arms, aloud asking how much his main student had grown. The teacher gathered his 4 young students around a generously set table. One of the students was stunned when the mentor generously placed a full bowl of food before him. One of the boys blushed deeply and awkwardly muttered a thank you. The youngest girl chirped happily about the meat, while another student stared shockingly at the mentor. The man, who had previously seemed unattainably cold to her, suddenly placed a piece of food directly into her bowl with his own hand. The boy caught himself in unexpected happiness, and the mentor promised to teach them secret techniques after the meal. He smiled warmly and allowed them to eat to their fill. The children joyfully pounced on the treat. Soon fullness was replaced by hard work. Tango Yul and Chekwa began training. The mentor clasped his hands behind his back, closely observing their meditation. Since the children's bodies were not yet strong, they had to start with exhausting internal techniques from which sweat poured down them. As soon as the saving permission to finish for today sounded, the students collapsed weakly into the grass. However, even at the limit of their strength, they stubbornly assured that they would manage and never give up. The mentor calmly sent the students to rest. They respectfully bowed. While the others hurriedly dispersed, the young man remained in place. The teacher handed him the sword and briefly asked if he was ready. The boy firmly gripped the scabbard. He smiled confidently, stepping back into a combat position. The young man suddenly felt a wave of excitement rising. The mentor did not take his eyes off him. A deep breath, words he had heard twice before in a past life surfaced in his memory. He has no talent at all. A bitter memory appeared before his eyes again. The former cold verdict that he was completely untalented. He slowly drew the blade. If that was really the case, then trying to impress the teacher made no sense. A whirlwind of blue energy flared around, and the boy prepared to simply show everything he was capable of. The man shuddered in shock. He recognized his own sword in this movement. The young man put the experience of his entire life into the golden flash. The strike unleashed the true power of the sword of heavenly will. The blade trembled dangerously because the technique was still raw. He gripped the hilt until his knuckles turned white, forcibly taming the weapon. A firm step forward, he was no longer afraid of mistakes. Even imperfect, this technique, created in 10 days, broke out with complete destruction. A huge wave of energy cut through the air and crashed into the ground with a roar. The boy stopped, greedily gasping for air. Cold sweat rolled down his face as he exhaled with relief that it was finally over. Unexpected footsteps made him turn sharply. A grim mentor stood before him. The man said emotionlessly that he had no talent at all, but the young man decided not to be upset. A calm smile blossomed on his face as the familiar continuation of the phrase sounded. The old man still acknowledged his gift. Li Hui froze in surprise, and a drop of sweat rolled down his cheek. The man opposite only smiled confidently and repeated that the young man truly had talent. Hui stepped back in confusion, refusing to believe it. When asked why the mentor would lie, the student replied that he had made a lot of mistakes and constantly lost his balance. The memory of the trembling sword in his hands only confirmed his confidence in his own ineptitude. The swordsman listened to these excuses, then calmly addressed him by name. He slowly moved forward and asked Li Hui what he considered talent in general. The young man fell silent in confusion. People constantly talk about the size or depth of some vessel, but these are just other words, the elder explained. Is talent being born with a legendary body and insane strength, or the ability to master a blade in 2 swings, or a sharp analytical mind? The man squinted intently and asked if the ability to remember absolutely everything at first glance is considered a talent. Hubi blinked in amazement, and the interlocutor smiled warmly. All these are indeed talents, but there is something more. The mentor suddenly grabbed his hand and firmly assured, this is also a talent. Calluses hardened and rubbed to blood were visible on the palm. The man smiled gently, recalling his tireless work. The boy was confused because mere persistence was not enough. However, the teacher stood his ground. The young man knew how to find his own path. He saw before him someone capable of finding his true answer. Even without speed or high achievements, his stubbornness would allow him to endure longer than anyone. And this was his true talent. The boy's eyes instantly filled with tears. The teacher good-naturedly tousled his hair in response to the sincere gratitude. The young man clutched his clothes on his chest, realizing all his life he had simply sought the mentor's recognition. One simple, well done, was all he had wanted to hear for so long. At the end, the teacher ordered him to go his own way and not be afraid to try new things. And he himself promised to watch from the side and definitely help when the time comes. The boy bowed low to the mentor and quietly thanked him. The man calmly asked what exactly he had finally realized. Gathering his thoughts, the student confidently replied that now he sees the hidden connection between everything in the world. The mentor smiled approvingly, confirming that the student had finally taken the right path. Suddenly, the mentor smiled slyly and let out a powerful battle cry. Three younger students froze in silent stupor. They looked puzzled at the older brother, who was standing alone near the distant wall. With a sharp scream, the young man rushed forward. His boots slammed into the ground with a rumble, raising dust. But already in a moment, he stopped and howled in disappointment. The move failed again. The younger ones exchanged confused whispers, not understanding why he was practicing this strange quick step to exhaustion. Sweating profusely, the boy stubbornly returned to the starting position. They could only marvel at how he intended to cover the entire yard in just one burst. With a sharp cry, he rushed forward. The couple with a child opposite froze in confusion, not understanding what the hell was going on at all. The little one called out loudly to the mentor and ran towards him. The man instinctively picked up the child, listening to frightened complaints about the scary older brother. Another little one added a complaint too, amusingly poking with his finger. The master snorted in puzzlement. He looked attentively at Kvi, asking what he was going to show this time. The boy dashed forward and forcefully sliced the air with his sword. The mentor froze in surprise when, instead of continuing the attack, the student suddenly howled in despair from his own helplessness. Hui grabbed his head, completely confused in his movements. He reflexively crouched, as if habitually preparing for a strike. Recovering, the boy hurriedly bowed, and the mentor only calmly asked why he was frozen in front of the wall. Hui nervously fell silent. In his past life, he really belonged to Muriam, but he never became a great warrior. Everything ended with a devastating blow to the head. Back then, he taught no one, but he himself regularly and very painfully got beaten up. The boy caught his breath and admitted, endless, fast-step training finally led him to an important discovery. The mentor briefly nodded. A little embarrassed, the student explained that all this time he was racking his brain on how to dodge a strike using only one movement. In his imagination, a battle was already raging. The correct break of distance left the enemy's blade in the void, and a sharp forward lunge became a lightning-fast defense. Offense or retreat, everything was decided by the speed of the feet. Strike first, block first, run away first. The boy smiled confidently. If he could not become a great master, he would perfectly hone the one thing he really knew. The man warmed with his gaze, accepting such determination. He approvingly placed his heavy hand on the student's head, causing him to shine. The boy shone and joyfully exclaimed his agreement. However, the mentor suddenly grew serious and added that he had to report something else important. In a few days, a general meeting awaited them. The bearded man looked heavily ahead. The news about the unscheduled meeting confused the students, as they usually met only once a quarter. The man explained that the leadership was talking again about unity. The young man instantly put the puzzle together. The Shagan gang had just disappeared overnight. The entire Anson district buzzed about the fact that it was the mentor's work, who personally ordered him to clear the territory. The boy's face tensed from the strain. Seeing the real combat power, former allies suddenly remembered friendship, although after the death of the previous leader, they ruthlessly severed all ties. He wearily rubbed his temple because foreign intentions were too easy to read. But the real blow was the elder's demand. The young man also had to appear at the meeting. He shockedly pointed a finger at himself. The day of the gathering arrived. The young man irritably walked down the corridor. He dreamed of simply taking care of the younger ones, not getting involved in politics. Pushing aside the hall doors, he perfectly understood. Everyone just wanted to stare at that very student for whom the Sword Sonnen had wiped out an entire gang. However, he was not going to play to the audience, nor did he have anything to do so. The young man cautiously turned his head. A tense question hung in the air about what they were doing there. In the depths of the room, three conspirators huddled closely together, quietly discussing the promised treats. The woman was fueling interest with mysterious stories, while the little one was already openly asking to go with the older brother. The girl smiled slyly upon hearing these strange conversations, while from around the corner, they were being watched attentively. The thought to simply ask the mentor was interrupted by a sharp movement. The woman jumped to her feet, illuminated by a new idea. She feverishly whispered her plan into the little one's ear, and she, with cunning delight, pointed to herself with a finger. The young man nearby blushed to his ears and opened his mouth wide. He exclaimed emotionally that their second older brother was the coolest, not even noticing how that very brother stood confused at the doorway. His gaze ignited with determination, and a loud call to action sounded. The company was ready to spring into action. Meanwhile, the second brother nervously clung to the doorframe, covered in cold sweat from thoughts about what they had planned. Suddenly, the silence of the corridor was broken by heavy, measured steps of a burly man in black. The teacher frowned in surprise. 3 students suddenly jumped in front of him into fighting stances. Instead of attacking, they waved their hands, begging to be taken with him to the meeting. Fists clenched tightly from excitement. Desperate and sweet pleas poured out. One of the boys unleashed heavy artillery, a puppy look and a deep blush. He literally shone from his own cuteness, while the other children enthusiastically cheered for him from the side. The master recoiled, turning pale from shock. Tango Yul, a tear of horror rolled down his stern face from this performance, while the little ones joyfully demanded a continuation. The young man finished him off completely, coquettishly pointing to his cheek against the backdrop of blooming roses. Eventually, the mentor gave up and resignedly patted the triumphant students on the heads. The girl smiled sweetly and asked him to follow her, causing the boy to blush deeply, when suddenly a loud child's scream about an older brother rang out. The boy burst into a panicked scream, while she only laughed awkwardly. The little one whined ahead, begging the older brother to set off faster. The young man confusedly grabbed his head from their relentless noise. His gaze slid across the cloudless sky and a thought flashed in his mind. This is happening for the first time in both her lives. Their whole family finally gathered together. Carefree, smiling children and a sturdy man behind. They stepped forward together, rejoicing at the chance to set off somewhere altogether. The Changhyun clan held absolute power in Ansan County as the richest martial arts house. A small boy from the arriving group gaped in awe, examining the vast possessions. His eyes shone with delight, for the hosts were famous not only for gold. From ordinary landowners, they gradually forged a mighty clan, accumulating colossal wealth and strong ties for generations. Rumors said their influence had long gone beyond the county and reached even the upper echelons of the Udan sect. The guests froze before the grand multi-tiered building from which joyful greetings were already heard. The clan patriarch himself came out to meet them, the warmly smiling Chang Hyung-gon. He laughed good-naturedly, meeting the gaze of the tall leader of the guests, and mentally noted his striking changes. Standing nearby, the tense gang leader Shagan received a quiet order from the patriarch to keep himself in check. The patriarch sweetly welcomed the arrivals, while the dark-haired youth silently grew irritated by the adults' interference in ordinary children's quarrels. He cast a heavy, piercing glance. Jang Hyun-gon responded with an impassive nod. The youth moved forward with his people, fully aware that under no circumstances could they make new enemies now. The gray-haired elder waved off, as if to say everything was fine, and headed up the stairs. The gray-haired man hospitably invited everyone to enter the pavilion. The rest silently followed him. But near the very gate of the pavilion, a foreign voice caught up with them, apologizing for being late. On the stairs appeared the burly patriarch Jang Hyun, grumbling discontentedly that he was fed up with all this. But the gray-haired man immediately broke into a smile and began showering kindness, assuring that the guests had arrived just in time. Li Hui watched this theater with a cool head. He knew perfectly well that the enmity from the past life had not gone anywhere. Before the eyes, memories flashed like a terrifying blaze, burning ruins and dreadful shocks that would soon engulf this world again. To survive, the 4 great sects would have to unite into a single monolithic alliance. But first, it was necessary to deal with current affairs. An order was given to greet the attending leaders. Li Hui decisively raised his gaze. He stepped forward, folded his hands in a bow, and loudly apologized for past problems, calling himself the first disciple of Songyaman. It was time to cleanse his own reputation. The young man straightened up, respectfully, without a trace of sycophancy, showing only calm confidence. The gray-haired leader blinked in surprise, clearly not expecting such dignity from the boy. He smiled faintly. The simple and good-natured first disciple was no more. From now on, he would make everyone respect him, even without the mentor's support. His thoughts were interrupted by the juniors. Tango Yul and Chekwa greeted respectfully, and little Hokyeon simply joyfully spread his arms in welcome. Meanwhile, outside, the elders were mocking. The black-haired man waved off the idea that the boy was anywhere near perfect, and suddenly sharply changed his tone. The man loudly drew everyone's attention, indicating that it was time to move on to the main event. Loud applause. The gray-haired elder solemnly announced the official start of the meeting. Laughter echoed over the majestic multi-tiered pavilion. Cheerful chatter filled the entire courtyard. And inside the building, the languid Hoyeon sighed contentedly after an incredibly delicious lunch. Someone kindly handed a napkin to his smeared little face. The young man with a warm smile carefully wiped the child's cheeks. Yes! A joyful exclamation rang out. Dehun gloomily weighed his chances. In the past life, the Changhyun clan fell apart on its own, and the enemies only finished off the remnants. Old conversations of the elders about the destructive influence of the current patriarch surfaced in his memory. He had no idea how to stop this disaster, being an ordinary disciple of another sect. His reflections were interrupted by a loud, childish exclamation, which made the girl next to him jump. The boy came closer and seriously introduced himself as Changhyun Sohang, who was only 5 years old. The girl responded with a self-satisfied smile and boasted that she would soon be 6. She literally shone with her own importance. Sohang's eyes lit up. He clenched his fists, sincerely envying such an adult age. Dihan calmly intervened in the conversation and reminded the boy that he would also grow up soon. The children instantly understood each other and burst into laughter. The ability of these kids to make friends was truly enviable. Realizing he was left out of the group, the young man awkwardly said his name, to which the girl immediately asked about his age. He blushed deeply and suggested they be friends on the terms of a 10-year-old older brother, but Sohang rewarded him only with a heavy, silent look. "What a child," Li Hui said boredly, propping his cheek, recalling the senseless childish courtships and promises to give away all the toys. During lunch, a familiar person in a green robe bothered him again. In a past life, he had also desperately chased after a girl named Chekwa. The boy did not stop. He offered to go boating and boasted about overseas decorations bought especially for the birthday. Li Hui only smiled in his mind, vividly remembering how this wretched suitor despaired and crawled on his knees after her departure from the sect. Suddenly, he shifted his gaze to the door. A young man with a sword nervously wiping sweat entered the hall uncertainly. Li Hui instantly recognized the sect's first disciple and the eldest son of the leader, Changhyun Taehan, and calmly stated his name and greeting. The majestic image of this boy alongside the stern clan leader surfaced in his memory. At that time, everyone predicted incredible potential for Taehan. The new acquaintance warmly grabbed Li Hui's hands, happily announcing that, according to his father, they were peers, still unaware of his future dark fame. Later, he would become famous as the first of the 3 heroes of Changhyun, a libertine who would drown in drinking and women, dooming his own clan to self-destruction. For now, Taehan only laughed sincerely and chatted about his father, surprising Li Hui with his naive straightforwardness. Li Hui calmly noted that he and his father seemed close, hiding his own thoughts behind a light smile. In a past life, Cheng Hengan and Changhen Taehan hated each other, and their family's affairs rapidly deteriorated. The relationship between the patriarch and the heir was falling apart, which is why they did not survive the Shagun gang attack, although peace still prevailed between them at that moment. So why did their clan then decline? He convulsively grabbed his head. It was too deep an interference in the affairs of another family, and what could he even change at all? The heir awkwardly touched his hair and confessed with a warm smile that it was hard to find peers here for a simple conversation. After all, it was almost impossible for the children of the patriarch of the Changhen clan to find someone for such a casual chat. He looked intently at the boy, unable to understand why in the future this person turned into a hopeless scoundrel. Suddenly, the heir shuddered in fear. "Don't I smell like sweat?" he blurted out, causing him to recoil confusedly and wave his hands. Receiving a negative response, the boy wiped his forehead with relief and explained his panic. Now the elder of the Wudang sect is visiting them. The father placed great hopes that the son would be able to please this respected guest. The heir dreamed of becoming at least a secular disciple, so he ran here just from exhausting training, and at these words his interlocutor suddenly froze. A memory struck his brain like lightning. He remembered everything. He sharply turned over his shoulder, recoiling from the dazzling flash of light. Bare feet tore into the void. This very fall changed everything forever, and became the reason why Changhyun Taehan went down a crooked path. The screen was flooded with complete darkness. The perfect Muok sat motionless in meditation, radiating a mystical purple yin-yang aura. The most outstanding Grandmaster of Muriam towered over the crowd like an insurmountable mountain. Rumors went that once he had mentored the best. It was even said that among his students was the head of the Udan school, who by his early 40s was nothing special. The young man with a sword at his waist froze in confusion, trying to recall an important detail. The young man with a sword at his waist calmly thought, 20 years had passed since Muok stopped giving advice to anyone, but the memory from his past life brought a completely different recollection. Then the Changhan clan spent all their accumulated wealth and connections to invite the master. The owner of the Changhan trading district, Gan, stood then full of pride. Knowing his own mediocrity, he blindly believed that his son Taehan's talent would be enough to gain the perfect's attention. But Muok did not even look at the young man and gave him no advice, instantly letting the clan's wealth go to the wind. That day, a real quarrel broke out between father and son, all because of Chang Honggon's sickly inferiority complex, who could not come to terms with his weakness. Because of the frailty of his own martial arts, the master became increasingly cruel, driving the students to bloody vomiting. Unable to withstand this pressure, the children finally broke down and strayed from the path. Wasted wealth and a worthless heir did their job. The weakened Changhan clan fell overnight. He was simply crushed by the Chagon gang. The young man understood. Now he should worry about himself. But for the safety of the mentor and brothers, he had to stop the destruction of the local schools. But how could he, an ordinary student, make the Changhan heir save money? So the boy just awkwardly said goodbye. Gon asked in surprise when he began to wave off the fear of the master's sudden supervision, and added that he must immediately return to training. But the heir stopped him, directly stating that he came here precisely for him. He wanted to see with his own eyes the student whom the renowned sword valued so much that he was ready to reduce the entire school to dust. The young man bit his teeth bitterly, for he alone knew the future, having already returned from the dead. And now he looked into Gon's bright eyes, unable to tell the terrible truth. No matter how much he trained, he would achieve absolutely nothing. The young man agreed with a warm smile. Watching the hustle of the younger students, he sighed about the strict rules of his family and said goodbye to Li Hui. He turned around and walked away. Li Hui watched him go. Were they both doomed to achieve nothing? He tightly gripped the handle of the fan and sharply called out to his friend. The friend turned around confused. Li Hui decisively extended his hand forward. He firmly insisted on joint training. His fist clenched. Changhan Tihan, who far surpassed him in talent, also had every chance to change. Meanwhile, in the quiet courtyard, the elders discussed troubling news. The Salvan clan was mass hiring wandering warriors, supposedly due to a local conflict. A bearded man sipped tea, seeing through the bluff. Such an army was absolutely unnecessary for a minor feud. The other masters listened gloomily. The dark cup froze in the hand. The world of martial arts was rapidly descending into chaos. The gray-haired elder urged those present to unite in these troubled times, while the black-haired warrior silently sipped tea. He cast a squinting glance at the speaker. His intuition did not fail. Before him sat an absolute master. But what was the mighty Taoist from the Wudang clan doing here? The man in the green robe introduced the elder. It was the famous Mu Ak, who had come just to observe their gathering. The black-haired man forced a polite smile and called this acquaintance a great honor. The silver-haired Yu Hyunjin, known as the sword that pierces the clouds, also joined in the flattery towards the grandmaster. The warrior in crimson rejoiced at the opportunity to host such a legend, while the meeting organizer modestly joked away. The meeting was coming to an end, so Muaku was politely offered to go rest, and he immediately agreed. The elder silently closed his eyes, preparing to bow. Muaku quietly stood up, getting ready to head to the exit. 5 masters continued sitting around the round table in the sunlit gazebo. The black-haired man took another sip of tea, still puzzling over why the great Taoist needed to go all the way to Ansan Hyun for these minor gatherings. The old Taoist in white attire calmly stood before the carved gate. Finding himself alone, the old Taoist grimaced irritably. Suddenly, he stomped his foot in displeasure, shedding the image of a noble sage. The man sighed wearily. He scratched his chest and admitted to himself that he fled here precisely because of the nausea from strict rules and tiptoeing through life. Due to rare outings from Mount Wudang, the outside world seemed extremely uncomfortable to him. Silence. Suddenly a battle cry rang out, causing the old man to turn sharply. At home, these training shouts drove him mad, but here they unexpectedly lifted his mood. Intrigued, he quickly headed towards the noise. In the yard, a young man in green clothes was slicing the air with a wooden sword with a fierce cry. The Taoist comfortably leaned on the railing and began to watch the boy's movements with interest. The old man recognized in him the eldest son of the clan leader, the very Changhan Thehan. The gray-haired master calmly observed how the young man in the yard practiced the basic sword technique of the Wudang school. He smiled ironically. The boy brazenly abandoned his own clan style and stubbornly wielded a foreign sword. Did he want to become an apprentice or just get a free tip? The young man sliced the air with force, leaving a red trail behind the blade. The goal was obvious, but the old man became frankly bored. His gaze remained indifferent. From this standard sword, Sokon was already simply nauseated. The movements were perfect, but absolutely empty, like in thousands of other beginners. He had already turned to leave when suddenly he squinted, hearing voices. A girl appeared in the yard and immediately clung to the boy with questions about his experience. The young man awkwardly scratched the back of his head, admitting that he had been training for only 3 months, and the girl was instantly twisted with shock. She broke out in a cold sweat. In her past life, she had spent 3 months just to simply memorize the stances, and while the boy naively complained about his clumsiness and his father's high expectations, she mentally howled with black envy. The dark-haired young man was emotionally proving something to Thehan, instructively raising a finger. The boy exhaled and sincerely thanked. The Han once again gratefully thanked for the unexpected support. The Han smiled broadly, and the mentor admitted, with such talent, it was no wonder that Zhang Honggan risked absolutely everything. He jokingly pushed the kid aside. His pace was so impressive that there was nothing to add. Firmly squeezing Thay Khan's shoulder, he ordered him to simply and confidently follow his own path. A sincere smile and a raised thumb. Silence. The Khan froze as if rooted to the spot. The thought of abandoning his father's path and forging his own frankly shocked him. Without waiting for a reply, the young man lazily waved goodbye and headed to his own training. He walked slowly across the square, not even suspecting the watchful gaze on his back. A gray old man with thick mustaches snorted in surprise. "Just look at this kid," he muttered, not hiding his sudden interest. Li Hui closed his eyes, concentrating pale blue energy around himself. With a loud scream, he suddenly bulged his eyes from the tension. A burst, and the boy instantly took off, cutting through the air. The old master and Li Hui's companion froze in shock, but control immediately disappeared. The boy senselessly stumbled midair. Marveling at his own strength, he crashed to the ground with a bang. The body stretched across the yard, and with a crack, slammed its head into a wooden pillar. The comrade panicked and rushed to him, while Li Hui, with a huge smoking ball, only muttered that something went wrong. When asked what that had just been, he awkwardly scratched the back of his head. The old master thought with admiration what an interesting young man this was. Li Hui joked cheerfully about his training, but the old man clearly saw his bones and muscles were completely weak. Throughout the Udon sect, there would be no bigger failure in terms of talent. The master thoughtfully scratched his beard, puzzling over this strange method. The sound of heavy footsteps made the young man with the sword and his companion cautiously turn toward the voice of the stranger. Before them stood a gray-haired man with his hair tied in a bun, hiding true strength behind a gentle smile. The girl tensed upon hearing his calm explanation about hidden presence due to the circulation of the aura of 10,000 seas. The elder slowly moved toward them. The young man broke out in a cold sweat. He did not feel the slightest fluctuation of energy as this master approached. This terrified the girl to death, because the guest was definitely a living person, not a ghost. Understanding the balance of power, Changhyun instantly folded his hands in a respectful bow and greeted the perfect one. The girl shuddered at the hard title. She quickly assessed his Taoist attire, which was radically different from the style of the Down faction. At this gathering, there could only be one Taoist in such clothing, and there were no more doubts. Li Hui hastily folded her hands in a greeting gesture. She bowed before the perfect Mu Ok, who kindly recognized her as a sword disciple Sonan from the Songhaman school. Changyon carefully nudged his confused partner in the shoulder, making her briefly confirm the elder's guess. The boy nervously fidgeted with his clothes and awkwardly explained that he was just practicing walking. The elder asked in surprise, while the hero realized at the same time, before him stood an influential figure he had not met even in his past life. Understanding that this man was the key to saving the Changhen family, he confidently replied that he had practiced a single quick step forward. It was necessary to make a good impression at all costs, so the hero firmly stated that one swift move decides everything in a fight. While the elder blinked in confusion, the young man calmly continued his thought. A faster step forward allows you to strike first, and a timely step back saves you from the enemy's blade. Suddenly, the courtyard was split by the thunderous laughter of the master, from which the hero shuddered. Smiling broadly, the elder enthusiastically embraced the idea to strike first and not receive a counterattack. He was sincerely pleased by such straightforwardness, although both young men stood completely bewildered. The man grew serious and looked into the distance, acknowledging that preserving one's body is the true goal of any martial art. He praised the hero for his early understanding of this truth, then cast a sharp, blade-like glance to the side. The hint was deadly. The blonde student nearby instantly broke out in a cold sweat, perfectly understanding who was meant. Li Hui respectfully thanked for the high praise. He bowed low to the master, while his companions silently stood nearby. His heart pounded from the recognition of such a venerable elder, but the young man quickly dismissed these thoughts. He pointed to his companion, emphasizing that the success belonged to him as well. The boy admitted that he achieved enlightenment precisely thanks to observing his friend's training. The companion nervously broke into a sweat when the master suddenly asked thoughtfully about Li Hui's name. The elder held a brief pause, scrutinizing the interlocutors intently. He calmly acknowledged that the young man's train of thought seemed extremely interesting to him. The master barely smiled and directly offered him to become his disciple. The boys froze in shock. Li Hui blinked confusedly, and the elder unflinchingly struck him with the fact The current head of the Udan sect is his martial grandson. An insane hierarchy emerged. By becoming this old man's disciple, the young man would turn the powerful sect leader into his martial nephew. The master cheerfully promised him unprecedented influence in Udan, while the boy panicked, wondering why he was even given such an offer. The young man sighed nervously, begging with all his might in his mind to pay attention to someone else. His companion anxiously awaited an answer nearby, but the path was blocked by a tall, gray-haired elder. The boy confusedly called him Perfect Muak. The young man's eyes sharply widened with horror. The elder mercilessly struck with his sword, but between him and the frightened boy, a figure in black flashed up like lightning. From the darkness flashed a crimson eye, and an icy voice growled, "What are you doing to my student?" The young man shockingly recognized his mentor, who blocked him with his body and directed the blade straight at the enemy. Muak only slyly smiled into his mustache, feigning surprise at the trembling of his own sword. The mentor's face darkened with rage, and with metal in his voice, he demanded an answer once again. The Gray Master felt a terrible thirst for murder. Before him stood a true bloodthirsty demon. Muak's body flared with powerful blue-green energy. The student panicked and grabbed his head, finally realizing his teacher really intended to kill the Perfect One. Two mighty auras, light and dark, collided in the middle of the courtyard before the inevitable battle. The title of the story flashed on the screen. The names of the creators flashed by. A stern man from the shadows lectured a little girl that it was not at all necessary for her to become the best. He raised a finger and harshly warned, "The main thing is to never stop, because from stagnation, they will simply rot." This simple belief once helped the small landowners of Changhyun carve out a place for themselves in the harsh world of Miriam. Years later, the now-grown girl fiercely sliced through the air with a heavy sword. However, several generations ago, the development of her clan completely froze. She gasped hoarsely from sharp pain and hunched over. The weapon fell with a dull thud onto the stone. The girl greedily gulped air, and sweat poured down her face like hail. The Changhyun family, the proud Murrim clan. Her trembling palms from exhausting training turned into a solid bloody mess. The growth of any clan in Murrim was always based on one thing, on combat strength, the strength of its leader. The gray-haired man looked at his own bloodied palms with mute horror. But for several generations in a row, the power of their leaders was at a standstill. Everything changed when the eldest son grew up, Changhyun Taehan. The young man swiftly sliced through the air with his sword. He had everything to glorify the family far beyond the native county. For his sake, the clan gathered rare elixirs from everywhere and hired renowned mentors. The elders firmly believed that these potions would awaken the boy's innate talent. Especially, they had hoped too much for the perfect Muaka, who was barely invited at the cost of all the clan's connections and wealth. The space exploded with a bloody aura as the dark silhouette delivered a devastating strike with a sharp jerk. He grabbed his head in panic and cried out with tears, not understanding what was happening at all. The boy grabbed his head in panic. His mentor was seriously going to kill Muaka. Two met in the square. An old man in white radiated a ghostly green light, and his opponent grinned from within a black aura. The old man smiled and admitted that he had seen many demons, but next to this swordsman, they all seemed holy. The young man shuddered fearfully at the thought of inevitable murder, when suddenly an unexpected proposal sounded. Let the student decide for himself. He looked up confusedly at both masters. The man in black confidently said that the boy would definitely agree. The question hung heavily in the air. The boy froze, hiding his gaze. He had to choose between the prestigious Udan clan and his current mentor. Observers around had no doubt about the choice, as it was simply impossible to refuse Udan. Moreover, the status of a disciple of Muaka himself would automatically make the young man seniored even to the head of the sect. In the literal sense, the imagination was stirred by the image, where respectable elders respectfully bowed their heads before him. One word, and he would instantly gain everything that in Murrim they could only dream of. The man in green was stunned. Instead of immediate agreement, the young man categorically refused the offer. Three witnesses of this conversation almost choked with indignation, unanimously calling him an idiot. The mustached elder froze, shockingly asking if he had heard correctly. In the middle of the wide courtyard, a tense pause hung, after which the master still asked to explain the reason for such audacity. He frowned and thoughtfully rubbed his chin. The young man's gaze remained piercing and focused. The boy calmly replied that he simply did not want to endure constant, vigilant attention to his person. His face was completely impassive. The old man was so taken aback by such frankness that he broke out in a cold sweat. The young man continued, "If he agrees to the proposal, the adult disciples of the Udan sect will suddenly have a leader who is much younger than them. Moreover, the elder had never taken disciples before, So the expectations for the newcomer would be sky high, and the risk of disappointing everyone too great. The master was gloomily silent, absorbing every word. The young man with his sword smiled nervously, clarifying whether he was really so afraid of external pressure. The warrior with a scar on his forehead grimly confirmed, even if he meets all expectations, this burden will not disappear. While the man in the background was clutching his head over the wasted chance, the boy suddenly laughed. He sharply turned around, sincerely agreeing that there is nothing worse than living under others' scrutiny. A brief pause hung in the air. The boy smiled warmly, causing his interlocutor to become wary. He casually remarked that despite his appearance, he can cook quite well. After that, he enthusiastically suggested to the master to become a guest of their sect. A barely noticeable smile flickered on Li Hui's stern face. Meanwhile, in a quiet office, a completely different warrior slowly reviewed scrolls, mentally wondering how long it had been since he last took up a weapon. The high title of the Heavenly Sword already frankly embarrassed him, but his calm was disturbed by a single fresh rumor. The man abruptly tore himself away from the papers, sincerely impressed by the news that his grandfather had suddenly taken on a student. The sect leader calmly skimmed through the lines of the letter. Muak never planned to take students. The old man refused to pass on his combat experience further, to protect his followers from the pain he had endured. A smile played on the reader's face. Someone had indeed managed to touch this stubborn eccentric. The message spoke of a strange boy whose dantian were completely closed. Yet despite this, the youth somehow maintained absolute natural harmony with the world. The leader blinked in surprise, reading that the audacious boy had refused Muak himself. The old man wrote that he decided to stay there for some time and strictly forbade being disturbed. The man quietly laughed, repeating aloud the name of the Songgimun sect in the name of that elder brother, Li Hui. Muak even invited him to visit to taste local dishes as soon as he stepped down from his leadership position. He leaned back in his chair and laughed heartily. Meanwhile, far from here, in a gloomy room, the flame of a candle flickered dimly while someone's voice tried to understand why the old monster settled in Songgimun. All the threads converged there again, the sword piercing the clouds in this mysterious Li Hui. From the darkness flashed a cold gaze from beneath a horned red mask. A brief pause hung in the air. The man in the demonic mask thoughtfully raised his head, wondering if it was just a coincidence. His fingers tapped irritably on the table. This stranger was becoming a real obstacle to their plan. From the darkness came a question about what to do next. Those present recalled the infamous phantom blade of the massacre, now rotting in their dungeon. In the eyes of the leader, a cold spark flashed. He snarled fiercely, understanding that the captive's uncontrollable rage would do all the dirty work for them. A brief order to release the monster cut through the silence. Meanwhile, the warm sun illuminated the peaceful mountain estate. The black-haired warrior greedily devoured rice, loudly enjoying the delicacy. The gray-haired elder squinted with pleasure over the cup, acknowledging that the cook's confidence was entirely justified. He demanded a second helping without hesitation. The young man smiled warmly and reached for the empty bowl. The elder watched the young man's back intently, sincerely impressed by his hidden abilities. The ordinary food on the table literally glowed with soft, life-giving energy. For a moment, silence reigned. The master squinted. The boy did this unconsciously, although according to the laws of Taoism, the centers of power work quite differently. The lower dantian nourished the earth, the middle purified the air, and the upper united the person with the sky. Such was the unshakable truth of the ancient teaching. The old man thoughtfully shifted his gaze to Li Hui. The young man smiled warmly with a bowl in his hands. None of his three centers had yet opened. He simply extended the rice. But the guest clearly felt his absolute harmony with the world. This broke all known rules, but suddenly the master's surprise was interrupted by someone's tense gaze. Two children at the table suspiciously and gloomily stared at him. The boy suddenly jumped up, and with a mouthful shouted that he would bite the old man if he tried to take their older brother. Noise arose at the table. The students convinced the mentor that without the older brother, the school would starve. The young man sharply stood up and cut off, saying he would go nowhere. Little Hoenn awkwardly blinked, holding a portion of greens. Brother applied energy, and the bowl with the hot dish smoothly flew straight to her. The table was enveloped in thick steam. The little one joyfully waved her hands, begging for more. But brother instantly became stern and attacked another student for leaving food on the plate. Then he coldly cut off Tango Yul's excuses in order to immediately eat the vegetables. He swallowed fearfully and quickly offered the mentor tea to save the situation. The young man smiled contentedly at the master. The gray-haired guest opposite silently chewed, mentally wondering that this boy had completely forgotten his past. Suddenly, he shattered the family idol with the news. Soon the head of the Changhyun family will arrive with his children. The young man closed his eyes and quietly asked again. With a carefree smile, the young man informed that guests from the Changhyun family were heading to them, instantly knocking the ground from under the mentor's feet. Cold sweat broke out on the old man, and his face twisted with genuine panic. With a bang, slapping his palm on the table, he shouted in despair, "And what do you order me to do?" The gray-haired elder sighed heavily. The young man nearby ironically asked if it was time to pay for the delicious food, which greatly upset his interlocutor. The head of the Changhyun family with children was just approaching the gate, and the boy immediately accused the elder of a cunning calculation. He squinted with satisfaction. The young man's predatory smile finally threw the man off balance. He had never seen such shamelessness. The elder's threat to immediately drop everything and leave was shattered by an indifferent remark, saying, "Let him go then." The next moment, the boy's hands respectfully folded in greeting. With a perfectly sincere smile, he greeted the head of Changhyun on behalf of his mentor. The elder also respectfully extended his hand to the guests and immediately received a pleasant compliment on his reliable appearance. The head agreed to go inside, secretly marveling at the manners of this unusual boy. Meanwhile, the young man calmly conveyed the master's apologies for his absence at the meeting. The whole group together moved across the spacious courtyard of the estate. The guest only good-naturedly laughed, brushing off the apologies as complete nonsense. The guest with long gray hair politely apologized for his sudden visit. Aloud, he assured that he sought exclusively peace and strengthening of ties in Ansan County. However, his gaze revealed suspicion. The host's hidden motives seemed too obvious to him. Meanwhile, two young men exchanged strained smiles and feigned warm brotherly greetings. The boys forcibly embraced, acting out a sincere brotherly greeting. Watching this, old Jinin barely restrained his rage, mentally cursing the shameless scoundrel. He was terribly outraged by the brazen proposal to pay with lessons for ordinary food. The Taoist crossed his arms over his chest and cut off, saying he would not fall for such tricks and would not give a single lesson. The dark-haired young man with the tray only softly smiled. Jinin irritably said that he was terribly mistaken in considering this frivolous boy a good person. The smile vanished instantly. The young man confessed in a cold tone that he really hoped to extract at least a crumb of wisdom from the master. The old man shuddered at such sudden seriousness. The boy calmly arranged the teacups on the table and added that he was not forcing anyone. He was simply creating opportunities. They slowly walked down the corridor. Jinin held a tray with tea, attentively listening to the elder. He emphasized that the final decision rests solely with the young man. The gray-haired master watched the boy's back and mentally admitted, now he understands him even less. Meanwhile, a dispute flared up among the students about the fact that in Marim, all other sects are just rivals. Someone indignantly asked Jinin why on earth he was going out of his way to share his knowledge with outsiders. The young man stopped in the doorway and calmly explained, they all need to grow to become stronger together. He looked back over his shoulder, smiling carefreely. But the master was not moved. He cut in dryly that their Sangyemun clan gains nothing from this generosity. A heavy silence hung in the air. The old man's face petrified. When Jin suddenly spoke about the fact that peace in Marimam has lasted too long, the master tensed and sharply asked if the boy was planning a coup. The young man instantly dispelled his suspicions. He intends to protect this world, his mentor, and his younger brothers, and the old man broke out in a cold sweat from these firm words. The young man walked through the courtyard with a tray, explaining to the senior master that every sect in Ansan County must become stronger. The young man insisted that for this reason, every sect in the county absolutely must strengthen. He followed behind and anxiously inquired whether a great disaster was really approaching Murim. The boy calmly confirmed that signs are already appearing, while cold sweat rolled down the old man's face. A memory from a past life struck his mind, a terrifying silhouette with burning eyes in the beginning of a great schism. Then everything began with an armed clash between the Seven clan and the Suwon estate. Hostility instantly engulfed the entire region. As soon as the balance in Ansan County collapsed into chaos, Sevan fighters mercilessly drew their blades. They covered it up as a local quarrel, but other masters already understood then. The clan is massively hiring Ronin and making its first move. Turning back to the conversation, the old man called the clashes a usual matter, but the young man suddenly froze. Over the years of peace, the sects had accumulated too much power. With a heavy look, he added that now all this only seemed like minor incidents. Before his eyes, the hellish flame exploded again, in which he once stood broken and helpless. He remembered all too well what horror these supposedly minor things would lead to, and that was why he was now desperately seeking strength for protection. His fingers clenched the edge of the wooden tray with a crunch. What would happen next? The elder thoughtfully stroked his gray beard and asked what they would do when Miriam plunged into chaos. The young man with the tray in his hand stood respectfully nearby and silently listened to the mentor. Later, he was already secretly peeking into the yard through the slightly open gate. Two children shouted indignantly at the grandfather, accusing him of outright cheating. He skillfully juggled the ball in the air, boasting of the great udang technique. One of the students sharply tried to intercept the toy, but the old man easily deflected it with his knee. The ball flew high into the sky. The grandfather momentarily lost vigilance, and the older brother immediately seized the prize. The boys with joyful cries rushed away, passing the ball to each other on the go. The old man fiercely waved his fists and chased after the little troublemakers. The young man looked confused at this circus. He had simply given them a pig's bladder so the children would make friends. The mentor triumphantly raised the ball above his head, gloating over the group of upset kids. The boy nervously scratched the back of his head. He expected something completely different, and the old victor collapsed helplessly on the grass, breathing heavily and complaining about aching bones. The young man laughed and handed the white cloth to the exhausted mentor, jokingly asking if he wasn't too cheerful for someone dying. The old man grumpily snatched the towel, but the boy only found it amusing. Somewhere in his memory flashed a warm recollection of friends laughing carefree together in a clearing. The young man turned with a sly smile, and the master silently acknowledged his skill. When asked about his plans, he casually said that after everything he would just rest and enjoy life, which greatly shocked his interlocutor. The boy sincerely did not understand what else to do after their victory, except eat and have fun. The old man looked at this bright, straightforward smile and aloud scolded the cheeky brat, although inwardly he admitted that he could not understand him at all. Suddenly, the master sharply stood up, causing the young man to flinch in confusion from the surprise. Measuring the student with a heavy gaze, the old man remarked that he was not much of a remarkable intellect, and nature had clearly deprived him of any combat talent. Even his intuition left much to be desired. The young man stood with an absolutely impassive face, listening as the mentor called him a very strange kid. Silence hung over the grass between them. The gray-haired man loomed threateningly over the young man and firmly ordered him to speak. "Who are you, really?" The sharp question sounded, yet the boy met it with an absolutely impassive smile. The young man froze, and behind his back in a cold blue glow appeared a ghostly silhouette from the past. The air vibrated with a foreign dark aura in the sharp question, who he really was. The gray mustached master burned him with a heavy gaze. The boy only barely smiled. The tension burst. The young man cheerfully squinted, listening to the old man laugh loudly and call him a cunning little boy. Both warriors calmly stood in the forest clearing, completely stopping the fight. The master relaxedly looked away, admitting that he hadn't had this much fun since joining the Udan sect. The boy quietly agreed. These words awakened a memory. Little Muak sits in the hall before the yin-yang symbol, endowed with the elder's authority from the very first day. The child looked ahead fearfully, crushed by the sudden duty before the entire sect. The young man mentally compared his current fate with that confused little one. Shadows of former comrades surfaced in memory, times when he himself bore the burden of the first disciple and elder brother of the school. He looked back over his shoulder with a bitter smile, vividly remembering how much this responsibility suffocated him in his past life. The boy frankly admitted that he used the guest visit to recruit children into the sect. The old master silently observed this conversation, but instead of anger, he laughed and friendly patted the young man on the shoulder. He had seen through this trick from the very beginning. The old man was satisfied with the fact that the boy was absolutely indifferent to whether he would take up teaching the children. The tension finally subsided, and the young man smiled with sincere gratitude. The group set off towards the estate amid carefree children's chatter. The master smiled warmly, frankly amazed by the local children. And in the hall, a rebellion was already brewing. A small girl threatened to bite the burly warrior if he dared to take their older brother. During the noisy dinner, the children brazenly accused the old man of cheating, disregarding his status and authority. This childlike spontaneity refreshed him considerably. He squinted contentedly under the sun, eagerly asking what they would play next. The wind swirled the fallen leaves. Meanwhile, near the Songru pavilion, rumors were already spreading. A mysterious boy refused Mu Akujin in himself for the sake of some uncle. The man remained sternly silent. His fingers were warming against a cup of hot tea. The exquisite beauty opposite him smiled slyly, noting that he should be completely satisfied. But instead of joy, the man sighed heavily. The woman sincerely did not understand why he was so sour after the victory over the greatest Muak Jin. Lowering his gaze, he gloomily admitted that he simply doubted whether it would lead to anything better. She asked in surprise why exactly. The warrior's face darkened with anxiety, and his hand was enveloped by crimson energy. The woman guessed that the whole matter was in his unstable martial arts. This destructive power could destroy everything around. Or perhaps he was deathly afraid that the young disciple would follow his dark path and become the same. He bitterly admitted both options, but the beauty just laughed and called the uncle a fool. His disciple was not at all like the rumors said about him. The man shuddered in amazement, and all the tension instantly disappeared. Learning that the had already grown into a real man, he bowed his head low with relief and thanked Lady Roach. She then advised him to finally show respect to the disciple, after which the warrior abruptly changed the subject and asked the main question: why she had called him today at all. The woman lightly set the black cup on the table and suggested moving on to business. She majestically leaned back in the chair and uttered the name, "Go him," nicknamed the Phantom Blade of Slaughter. The man's gaze instantly sharpened at the mention of the head of the Chamion sect. Once he had personally wiped out this dark faction, but the leader managed to escape then. The memory of the old enemy painfully struck his nerves. A black and red aura of rage suddenly exploded from his body. A brutal scream flashed in his memory. "Drink to the bottom, scum!" While the woman calmly reported that she had finally tracked down the fugitive, thick darkness continued to aggressively swirl around him right in the middle of the room. The interlocutor did not even blink and smoothly poured him some tea. He took a sip right through the swirling aura and muttered hoarsely that he was counting on her. The woman waved off the thanks, calling it her usual work. But with a soft smile, she added that he had changed incredibly. He had learned simple emotions thanks to his new students. The aura finally dissipated, and the man silently met her question: what he would do if the rumors turned out to be true. The woman smiled calmly, but suddenly she was twisted with horror. The thought that he could have survived knocked the ground out from under her feet. A heavy blood-red aura instantly crushed someone into the floor. Watching this flash of rage, she could not believe that just a second ago he was sitting completely calmly. From the darkness came a cold verdict: he would have to kill with his own hands. Meanwhile, a crowd was peacefully strolling through the evening streets of the city, and in one of the eateries a fight was brewing. Curses and broken dishes flew over the table. The mercenaries sprang up, outraged that someone was trying to command them. The trio brazenly laughed, demanding their interlocutor shut up and just drink. The white-haired swordsman lazily looked around and agreed. Such trash would never become his subordinates, because all his people were already dead. He grinned horribly and admitted that he personally sent them to the other world. Drunken laughter abruptly stopped. Clutching a bottle of sake, the white-haired man threw a wild look at them and declared, now they would unquestionably do everything he said. The dark-haired man hesitated confusedly, assuming that it was really possible. He was sharply interrupted. From the darkness, a sinister red eye flashed. The stranger cut off, saying that his words were too complicated for their understanding. The trio at the table wilted and nervously coughed while they were reminded of the proverb about the enemy of one's enemy. The gray-haired man with a jug grimly grinned, adding that he did not expect loyalty from such scum. He carelessly placed his bare foot directly on the severed head and ordered them to silently do as commanded. Calling them worthless creatures, the gray-haired man turned away, leaving the mercenaries in shocked silence. His bare feet stepped with wet squelching through puddles of blood. The footsteps stopped. The gray-haired man smiled predatorily, declaring that surviving at any cost was worth it for only one reason. He swept his gaze over the hall piled with mutilated bodies. To continue looking at such pitiful scenes, 6 guards in black armor lined up in a solid wall, pointing their spears. One of them stepped forward and sharply ordered the bloodthirsty killer to surrender. The stranger opposite only irritably threw out that he hates these slow government lackeys. With a predatory smile, the gray-haired man raised a black pill to his lips, offering the enemies to take the medicine. 3 of his fighters in the background loudly cracked the same ones. While the guards shouted to drop weapons, the gray-haired man tightly gripped the hilt of his sword. He threw back his head and burst into wild laughter, exhaling black smoke from his mouth. His hand tensed to the limit, covered with a coarse network of veins. Shrouded in a sinister aura, the man bent down and admitted, "This drug is sheer madness." The space around instantly engulfed in bloody darkness. His eyes were flooded with complete darkness, and he croaked that now these bastards would understand everything. The frenzied accomplices with burning gazes pounced fiercely into the attack. The gray-haired man grimaced horribly. They had returned from the very hell. The face, scarred and soaked with blood, spread into a terrifying smile. The Phantom Blade of Slaughter announced its return. The bloody glow abruptly changed to the title inscription. Meanwhile, in a dark room, children snored carefree in their sleep. The young man quietly opened the door and stepped outside. Walking through the yard, he thought that aimless fuss would not help them lay the foundation for martial arts. A daytime ball game flashed before his eyes. In the heat of the competition, the little ones ran like mad, not noticing their own fatigue at all. Stopping in the shade of the trees, the young man realized exhausting training could easily be disguised as entertainment. He raised his gaze to the bright full moon, considering what would be best to start with. Suddenly, he thoughtfully touched his chin. Behind the massive gates, it was quiet, and the mentor, for some reason, was greatly delayed. The girl nearby almost cried along with the puppy, worrying whether something bad had happened to the teacher on the way. The young man blinked confusedly, blinked and somewhat awkwardly remarked that she really was very concerned about the master's fate. The boy came closer, worrying about the mentor, and the old man only laughed and again cast the fishing line about apprenticeship. The words hung in the air. The old man intently looked into the face of the interlocutor. He refused without blinking, reminding that he had already rejected this offer. The old man bulged his eyes and shouted indignantly that he insanely envied such a scoundrel. The boy smiled warmly. He respected his master not out of blind duty or rules. He would serve him just as faithfully, even without any lessons in martial arts. The old man's eyes widened with realization. The boy saw in the mentor a true native family. Observing this unconditional devotion, the elder realized that the entire Songyaman clan depended on this young man, and he wanted to win him over even more. He discarded any dignity and began to comically beg, promising that the boy wouldn't even have to train. Suddenly, the elder's tone became more severe, and he reminded about the Wudang sect. Silence. Finally, he warned that because of such stubbornness, the junior disciples would hate him again. The boy confidently raised a finger while the mustached old man irritably scolded his unbearable stubbornness. The old man finally gave up, waved his hand, and sent the youth to meet the mentor. The heavy doors creaked open. The teacher stood on the threshold. He briefly said that he was delayed, while the old man behind grumbled discontentedly. Throwing a dry farewell, the mustached man quickly left. Silence reigned. The night sky was covered with a scattering of cold stars. They slowly walked through the dark courtyard, and the master calmly advised the apprentice to go to sleep. The young man felt tension and looked intently at the man. The mentor's face was engulfed in shadow as he quietly asked permission to ask something. The man turned to the apprentice and directly asked if he regretted his decision. The boy froze in surprise, not expecting such concerns from him at all. Looking at the master's shining back, he remembered his past life and suddenly realized a terrifying thing. He absolutely did not know the person who then never asked him anything. The bearded warrior calmly looked ahead and firmly said that he did not regret his choice. The young man darkened and cut in that he also never regretted because the former place lost its meaning for him. There was no longer either mentor or brothers. He gently smiled at the confused interlocutor and admitted that it was here now his true sect and native home. The boy openly spread his arms to the sides against the background of the night courtyard and sincerely asked not to be driven away. A short pause hung, and the senior warrior silently shifted his gaze. Glancing at the majestic buildings of Songyaman, the bearded man quietly confirmed that this was indeed their common home, but suddenly became embarrassed and apologized for the excessive emotions. The boy just closed his eyes and warmly assured that everything was fine. The tension finally dissipated, and they stood calmly next to each other in the night yard. Suddenly, the man looked up at the sky and warned that he would soon have to leave for a short time, so there was no need to wait for him like this anymore. Both froze, gazing into the endless, bright, starry scatter. In the night silence, a short but firm promise sounded to definitely return home. Meanwhile, a surprised voice sounded at the tea table. For the first time, Maxunun visited here personally. The gray old man cautiously froze with a bowl near his mouth and directly asked what had brought the warrior to him. In the dim room at the tea table sat two people. Sonnen slowly poured tea, asking the interlocutor to look after his students for the next few days. The old man frowned. The request sounded strange from a person who not long ago had drawn a sword on his own senior student. The teapot with a dull thud was placed on the table. Sonnen spoke about the surviving leader of the dark sect he had destroyed. His gaze grew heavier. The goal was the phantom blade of slaughter, a bloodthirsty maniac feared even by other dark sects. Last time this monster managed to escape, but now rumors have appeared about his return. The elder suddenly interrupted the story. He directly asked whether Sonnen could handle such an enemy alone, since the swordsman himself knows the limits of his body well. The old man heavily closed his eyes. Sonnen sat completely motionless, although his figure was already uncontrollably enveloped by a sinister, bloody aura. There was very little time left before the body would completely fail. The elder folded his hands on his chest and directly reminded the sword Sonnen that he knows the limits of his own body best. Sonnen sat in a trance, radiating a dense crimson aura. The verdict is merciless. The body will soon fail. The elder tensed and quietly asked if the truth was known to Li Hui. Sonnen sighed painfully. The mentor inquired, Could it be that he intends to bear this burden alone? The warrior calmly called the destruction of health the price for a wrong choice and promised to hold on until his last breath. The elder wearily rubbed his forehead. Sonen's path was not demonic. In memories emerged a grim silhouette of a warrior among the slain enemies. It was neither the path of evil nor the path of the righteous. The elder heavily placed his hands on the table, finally resigning himself to this bitter truth. Sonun looked him in the eyes and dryly stated that if he continued training, he would simply die. His gaze slid over the empty shelves of the quiet room. The elder, in despair, grabbed his head, while the doomed swordsman remained motionless, sitting in the semi-darkness. The story of the great elder brother Li Ho began just like that. A peaceful evening was abruptly interrupted by a child's scream. Someone was upset about unfair play. In the yard, the noisy trio from the Chang Hen family gathered again, starting a dispute with the elder. The youngest fiercely waved his fists, shouting that using movement techniques was unfair, and his sister loudly agreed with him. Instead of excuses, the space was torn by a swift jerk. A man dashed through the yard like a blurred shadow, almost knocking down other students. He calmly reprimanded the little ones. If they don't like something, let them try to apply the techniques themselves. The girl angrily called him a scoundrel, and the boy desperately reminded that they hadn't even been taught them yet. The elder snorted, condescendingly, that slow ones always have plenty of excuses, until suddenly the boy fearfully faltered. Two young men on the side twitched in confusion. A lightning-fast step raised dust, making the boy dizzy as he spun on the spot. The students confusedly turned their heads, completely losing sight of the target. And in a moment, a strong palm grabbed the boy by the head. He amusingly kicked his legs in the air and shouted about a sneaky ambush. Someone laughed cheerfully. Now the caught Kohyun had to be it in tag. The old man jokingly lifted the displeased Kohon by the collar, while the others joyfully shouted to run. Muak turned away and pressed his lips, barely holding back laughter at the children's complaints about the mischievous grandfather. The boy instantly forgot the offense, jumped into a funny stance, and shouted that now he would definitely catch everyone. From the side, it seemed that Perfect Muak really had a natural talent for babysitting children. Suddenly, a bell jingled outside. A sweets merchant approached the gate. The children froze, clenching their fists in delight. Muak smiled warmly, as the merchant had not been seen for a long time. Memories took him back to the past, where he was holding the hand of a child who incessantly begged for candy. The one who was now missing in Songomon came to mind. His younger brother from a past life, the fifth disciple, who once cried bitterly in his arms. Back then, the sect barely survived without money, and he could not buy even a little for the child. But now everything would be different. The young man's gaze filled with unwavering determination. He firmly promised himself to change fate, watching the children happily run to the gate, even if some of them grumbled about the tasteless sweets from this merchant. The disciples peered out from behind the wall in a group, whispering to save their appetite for the local delicious dinner. The boy crossed his arms over his chest in offense, grumbling that it was not necessary to limit themselves to sweets alone. Suddenly, he was called by name. A stocky mentor confidently descended the stairs with a sword at his belt. He warned that he had to leave for a few days. The boy walked alongside, asking if this was the planned trip, to which the master told him not to worry. The man smiled reassuringly and firmly promised to definitely return. His broad back soon disappeared behind the gates. The apprentice silently watched him go, thinking that the mentor was setting out on a journey not for the first time. But right now, his soul became uneasy. He anxiously clutched his shirt near his heart, trying to calm a sudden bad premonition. 3 long days passed since the master's departure. The usual schedule at the Songgimun school remained unchanged. From early morning, the boy had to scrub the floor and wring out heavy laundry. During the day, after finishing the housework, he entertained the children of the Chang Hen family. And just as they were leaving, Tango Yul and Shkwa instantly passed out right during the practice of the Manhwa art. Hoen was falling asleep already at dinner, so the time for his own training came only late at night. He closed his eyes, trying to focus. Dash! Wrapped in a blue aura, the young man dashed forward like lightning. But the movement broke off, and he braked heavily on the grass. Irritated, grabbing his head, he admitted to himself that he was constantly distracted. Thoughts stubbornly would not let him concentrate. He raised his gaze to the night branches. In the past life, the mentor did not go anywhere until the very end of spring. His face tensed with an anxious question. He thoughtfully rubbed his chin, trying to understand what exactly broke the usual chronology. The young man gazed at the night sky and wondered if his actions had changed the future, when suddenly a loud shout tore him from his thoughts. He turned to the perfect Muak, who immediately guessed that the boy was once again worried about the mentor. The young man awkwardly confessed his anxieties, to which the elder only laughed out loud. Could it be that he fears the teacher might get hurt somewhere? Silence fell in the night courtyard, and Muak advised not to worry in vain. But the boy's face darkened, and he directly asked what the elder had recently spoken about alone with the mentor. Muak calmly stroked his beard and replied, "The teacher simply asked to watch over them because all the students are still too inexperienced." The boy lowered his gaze, fully aware of his own shortcomings. He clenched his sword with a single desire: to become at least a little stronger. So much so that he would never again be a burden in a real fight. Muak advised to stop tormenting himself and just hone his skills, to which the boy quietly agreed. The elder stood silently nearby. The young man raised his eyes, finally acknowledging the guest's correctness. Now all that remained was to work tirelessly on himself. The gaze flashed with determination. From now on, he will devote all his strength to training. He clenched his fists tightly, firmly stating that he has no doubt in his diligence. The gray mustachioed man slyly cleared his throat. The boy turned out to be surprisingly simple. Although he is not his mentor, he can oversee the training. At such a statement, the young man nervously broke into a sweat. A brief moment of silence. The old man's face instantly became stern. The air around trembled heavily when the harsh order to show all his strength was given. The old man clasped his hands behind his back and said indulgently that although he is not this young man's mentor, he is fully capable of overseeing his training. The master's gaze was heavy and calm. He briefly ordered the boy to show everything he is capable of. Twisting his mustache, the old man added that countless warriors would kill for his advice, which made the student nervously blink. The master coldly cut in that he is not at all like a joker. And already the next moment he jumped up at the scream, demanding to stop staring and start, because he actually still needed to sleep. The young man quickly gathered himself, understanding that the supervision of the perfect Muaka himself was his lucky ticket. He desperately needed to become stronger, even if only by a little bit. The boy closed his eyes and exhaled loudly. He completely focused on the feeling of the ground beneath his feet. The blue energy struck with such force that small stones flew around. He felt the earth literally slipping from under his feet. And with a blue flash, he dashed forward. The young man closed his eyes, concentrating blue energy around himself. With a sharp exhale, he dashed forward. The gray mentor silently analyzed each of his movements. The body lost balance. Movements became slow and clumsy. Another attempt ended with a fall. He slowly got up after a new failure. The boy knew if he repeated it again and again, he would definitely find the right answer. One more time. No one was going to stop. Time relentlessly moved forward. High in the mountains above the mansion roofs, only heavy breathing was heard. The boy was dripping with sweat, barely standing on his feet from exhaustion. Exhausted, he bowed apologetically to his mentor. The master was only surprised, since he himself had given the order to train, so apologies were absolutely unnecessary here. The teacher's voice sounded like a verdict. The boy has not a drop of talent. A heavy fan with a crunch fell on his head. The young man clenched his teeth from the offensive truth, when suddenly the elder added that he still had one specific talent. Steps fell silent, and the mentor asked if the apprentice was ready to find his own answer. The boy froze, confused, behind his back. The master clearly stated that he needed observation and imagination. A short pause. The teacher sternly looked him in the eyes. "Master this, and you will get what you desire." The apprentice thoughtfully rubbed his chin, listening to the confusing explanations that for a true connection, one must first see the essence, or conversely, understand everything without any union. The silhouette of the youth was suddenly enveloped in a soft glow. The energy of acceptance and fusion flowed through his body. Remembering the order to first observe, then imagine, he forcefully rushed into attack. The blade of the sword flashed dazzlingly as the final instructions sounded, to turn one's own imagination into the voice of the weapon. The youth only sighed, for these talks about spiritual connections seemed like bizarre Zen riddles, and yet he felt their hidden weight deep inside. The old master smiled gently and called the apprentice to sleep. Both slowly moved towards the dark mansion. Somewhere far away, the night sky was covered with cold clouds. The wind ominously drove black shadows in the darkness. Along the forest path at this time, a bearded warrior walked alone with a bag on his shoulder. Suddenly he froze. The man tensed, squinting his gaze into the impenetrable thicket. From the darkness emerged a pale, bald old man with a crowd of killers behind him, and mockingly greeted Sonen's sword. Sonen instantly recognized these faces. Remnants of the dark arts sect were lying in wait for him. He slowly threw the burden to the ground, mentally scolding himself for having once allowed these rats to escape. The swordsman reluctantly admitted that he had acted too carelessly. In the dark forest, he was met by an entire squad, but the hero was interested in only one thing: where the phantom blade of the massacre was now. The bald leader burst out laughing and disdainfully threw out that the swordsman had lived in luxury all this time. While the enemy was showering insults, he simply aimed his weapon at him and coldly repeated his question. Enraged by such arrogance, the bald man took out a black pill and shouted to his people to do the same immediately. The crunch of a bitten shell, the enemy's hand instantly swelled from the terrifying energy, and the swordsman immediately recognized the manifestation of dark arts. The bald man's body grotesquely pulsed with power, but the hero only dryly uttered the last warning. At the next demand to hand over the blade, the mutant responded only with a furious roar. The enemy hysterically shouted about the swordsman's obsession, so he sighed and decided to force the truth out by strength. The air was torn by a bloody black flash. The blades clashed head-on, sparking a shower of sparks. But the hero's power proved insurmountable. With one sharp swing, he threw the monster far back. Borden froze and was covered in cold sweat, not understanding where this terrifying power came from. The bald opponent crookedly smiled through a purple aura and asked if he wanted to know where the phantom blade was hidden. In a mocking tone, he added, "The blade is right now exactly where it will scare the great sword Sonnen the most." "It can't be." Sonnen paled from the terrible realization. A powerful wave of dark energy knocked the swordsman off his feet, while the enemy sardonically praised his insight. Sonnen managed to rush forward and deliver a sharp counterstrike, deeply cutting the bald man's chest. But instead of a cry of pain, only wild laughter sounded. An old scroll fell on the table with a dull thud. The mistress Rudzu looked at the hieroglyphs with an empty gaze, bitterly blaming herself for her blindness. The puzzle came together. The brazen massacre of government troops in Bokyu County was just a bloody spectacle for attention. And the appearance of the killer in another city exactly when the uncle left was not a coincidence at all. She was pierced by cold horror. She herself had played into the enemy's hands and helped lure the uncle out of Songamun. This terrible realization was interrupted by the scream of a frightened subordinate who suddenly burst into the room. The girl in the blue cloak froze, dripping with cold sweat. The ragged and exhausted Lady Rudzu exhaled the terrible news. The phantom blade of slaughter attacked Songamun. At that very moment, strength finally left the woman, and the girl sharply rushed to catch her. Rudzu convulsively gasped for air, pressing her trembling fingers to her forehead. In her memory flashed the mad grimace of a gray-haired maniac with a burning eye, who confessed with pleasure that it all happened because of him. His gigantic, bloodied hand was already inevitably looming over the peaceful estate. Darkness descended upon Songamun.